Did you have a good Thanksgiving?
I spent all of Thanksgiving vacation sitting there reading these transcripts.
Yes.
I ate like a turkey that came to us in the mail that was already cooked.
Are we going to have a good Christmas?
Well, we'll just see.
Bless you.
Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, holidays.
I get it. You're mad.
I don't hate anybody.
Representative Collins, reason I asked.
You don't hate anybody.
The president's mad.
Well, he's two-faced.
My Republican friends are mad.
That is simply just not right.
My Democratic friends are mad.
Get your words straight, Jack.
My wife is mad. My kids are mad. Even my dog seems mad. And Luna's a golden doodle, and they don't get mad.
I did not accuse you.
You did.
I asked a question.
You're a damn liar, man. That's not true.
I resent your using the word hate in a sentence that addresses me. I don't hate anyone.
Son of a bleep.
So don't mess with me when it comes to words like that.
The problem is NAFTA was implemented in 1994.
We all have a cell phone now.
That's back when the Backstreet Boys were topping the charts and MC Hammer was popular.
And many of us have iPads and computers.
I ask unanimous consent that the remaining votes in this series be 10 minutes in length.
Without objection.
View of having leverage against Israel.
When our allies, time has expired.
I'd ask to yield 30 more seconds, please.
I'll yield the gentleman 10 more seconds because we.
Thank you. I'll go fast. When our ally Israel faces more than 450 rockets fired by Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists in Gaza, it must have the ability to defend itself no matter what.
There's also one very large thing. Our chairwoman actually stated about the things not getting done and how this has been bad. But we have a saying down south is when something's going to be important, my mom would tell me, you're going to go on, I want you to go put your Sunday best on and we're going to go to town.
I ask for the yeas and nays. I can't hear.
We're leaving. You don't care about our bill?
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it.
I'm very sensitive.
The bill as amended is passed.
If you love America, mamas, don't let your babies grow up to go to Harvard or Stanford Law School.
Mama, don't let your babies grow up to
go to Harvard or Stanford Law School.
For the witnesses or additional material.
We have a unanimous consent request.
Too late. The witnesses or additional
materials
materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.
Yeah, that's just typical, isn't it? Just typical.
So we're all mad.
Mama, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys. Don't let them pick guitars and drive them old trucks. Make them be doctors.
Okay.
Yeah.
Committee will come back to order. When we recessed, we were engaging in questioning of the witnesses under the 5-minute rule. We will continue doing that. I recognize
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request before we start.
The gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
I would request that we enter into the record the FISA applications and other aspects of the FBI's Crossfire Hurricane.
I reserve a point of order.
I think if we're going to
this is the reserving. What are you entering here?
The FISA report that just came up.
Oh, we need
the Inspector General's report. We'll genesis of this whole thing.
We'll take that under advisement until we can review it, and we'll rule on it later. I mean, we'll hopefully grant it later.
I withdraw my reservation.
Mr. Sensenbrenner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to follow up on the two series of questions that the ranking member, Mr. Collins, directed at Mr. Goldman relative to the telephone company subpoenas and the inclusion of certain information in the majority report from the Intelligence Committee. Let me say that there are two issues involved. One that is not involved is the legality of the subpoena. I believe that that was a subpoena that is fully authorized under the law and under congressional procedures. Where I do have a problem, and a really big problem, however, is the fact that somebody made a decision to match certain data, metadata that had been collected through the subpoena with phone numbers of journalists and members of Congress. And That is the beginning of a surveillance state, which I think is outrageous, particularly since with the Freedom Act in 2013, we curtailed the NSA's ability about that. Now, had Chairman Schiff decided to man up and come here and talk, rather than hiding behind Mr. Goldman as chief investigator, as his surrogate or legate, if you will, I think we could have gotten to the bottom of this, and we could have taken action to make sure that this never happens again. You know, I do not want to see members of Congress, through their subpoena power, being able to subpoena the telephone records of private citizens willy-nilly without any kind of cause, or to match the numbers up with somebody else to see who they were talking to, and then going the next step and publishing the results of that match in a report that the minority hadn't seen until it was released. That, I think, is an abuse of power. We're talking a lot about abuses of power here in the White House and in the executive branch. Here we see a clear abuse of power on the part of the people who are prosecuting this impeachment against the President of the United States. They should be ashamed of themselves. Now, I come from the state where Joe McCarthy came from. I met Joe McCarthy twice when I was first getting into politics as a teenager. Folks, you have made Joe McCarthy look like a piker with what you've done with the electronic surveillance involved. It is something that has to be put a stop to now. It is something that has to be fessed up to now, whether it's you, Mr. Goldman, that authorized the matching and the publication, or whether it was Chairman Schiff. I would have loved to put Chairman Schiff under oath so that he could be required to answer the same way you have, Mr. Golden, on how this all happened. But as one who has spent quite a bit of time curtailing the excesses of the Patriot Act, which I authored, with the Freedom Act, which I also authored, you know, the surveillance state can get out of control. This is a major step in the surveillance state getting out of control in the hands of the Congress and in the hands of a majority party that wants to influence political decisions relative to politicians, in this case President Donald Trump, that they don't like. And they haven't liked him from the beginning of his term. They have tried to talk about impeachment since the beginning of his term. They thought that the Mueller report was going to be the smoking gun. It ended up being a cap pistol. Now they're working on this. And the steps that they have gone, the violation of common sense, the precedent that they have started, and looking at the way the chairman has conducted this hearing today and in the previous hearings, not even to allow Mr. Getz to make a point of order that he can't see what you put on the screen, I think goes against the entire fabric, you know, of American democracy. Shame on those who have done it. And if we want to get back to something objective, maybe it's time to push the recess button. I yield back.
Chairman Adler, could I just respond quickly on the phone records?
Respond.
Only because it's now
Mr. Chairman, I yielded back.
No.
I didn't ask him a question. I made a statement.
The gentleman yielded back. The gentleman yielded back. Ms. Jackson-Lee is recognized.
So, Mr. Goldman, let's get to the facts again. During the phone conversation on July 25th with President Zelensky, President Trump was narrowly focusing on his own political survival, using his public office for private and political gain. The truth matters. Then we heard counsel for the Republicans say the president's concerned about foreign aid because you could kiss it goodbye, assuming that's referring to anti-corruption. But let's look at the facts of the July 25th call. I happen to have read it just recently, which sharply illustrates the president's willingness to abuse the power of his office for his own personal benefit. The memorandum of that call is on the screen in front of you, and it shows that President Trump says, and by the way, right after President Zelensky spoke about defense support and the javelins, I would like you to do us a favor, though. So, this is a president's own behavior and words. Mr. Goldman, what was that favor?
The favor was to investigate a debunked conspiracy theory related to Ukraine interference in the 2016 election. And
Mr. Goldman, the investigative committees received evidence from multiple witnesses who testified that President Trump was provided specific talking points in preparation for the July 25th call geared toward protecting the American people's national security. Is that correct?
The talking points certainly were part of the official U.S. policy, and they included anti-corruption efforts and national security efforts, yes.
And those talking points were provided to help the president effectively communicate official U.S. policy interests during calls with foreign leaders. Is that right?
That is correct. It's a routine process that the National Security Council does, but the president generally is able to use them or not use them. Witnesses said the president's not required to use them. What was so startling here is that he not only veered off from them, but that he went to his own personal interests.
And it is fair to say such talking points signal the purpose of a given call, correct?
Yes.
Witnesses testified that the talking points for the July 25th call included recommendations to encourage President Zelensky to continue to promote anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine, which has a focus of American foreign policy in Eastern Europe. Is that correct?
Yes.
So to be clear, the talking points created for the president or other principals to discuss specific matters that really protect the American people. Is that accurate?
Yes, generally.
But witnesses such as Tim Morrison, the Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Europe, testified about what was not in those talking points.
Now, Mr. Morrison, were these references to CrowdStrike, the server in 2016 election, and to Vice President Biden and his son, were they included in the president's talking points?
They were not.
Are you aware of any witness who testified that investigating the Bidens was an objective of official U.S. policy?
No, it was not before and it was not after this call.
And anything ever found of those investigations that might have occurred?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the
Anything
question?
ever found of those investigations that may have occurred with respect to the former Vice President?
Every single witness said there's no factual basis for either of the investigations.
So Mr. Trump did not use official talking points?
Correct.
And there were fact witnesses who confirmed that?
That's right.
When you hear those words, do you hear the president requesting a thoughtful and well-calibrated anti-corruption program consistent with U.S. policy?
So, Mr. Goldman.
I do not.
We were hoping, we recommended the president very clearly support what President Zelensky had run on in his own election and what his Servant of the People Party had run on in its election where it received a majority mandate.
But that didn't come up in the call, did it?
No, sir.
So, Mr. Goldman, did the evidence prove that Mr. Trump utilized his position of public trust in order to accomplish these goals, his goals, in order to hurt his domestic political opponent?
Yes, that's what the evidence showed.
I've come to understand that America's values of democracy and justice must have the vital pillars of truth, factual truth, and trust. As a former judge and one who sat on this committee during impeachment in 1998, the truth matters. It's clear that the president did not really care about fighting corruption in Ukraine, but wanted his own personal interests to be considered. That kind of puts in perspective, Ambassador Sondland, that they didn't care whether Ukraine actually investigated, but really whether they just announced it. It is certainly well known that it is our duty, as the president poses a continuing threat, to, under the Constitution, pursue the truth. That is our duty. We are now proceeding to do our duty to find the truth. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the second hearing on impeachment that this committee has held in the last week. Well, I would submit that you're investigating the wrong guy. Let's look at the facts. Mr. Castor, Ukraine, that's been at the center of attention in this impeachment hearing, has historically been one of the world's most corrupt nations. Is that correct? That's correct. And under legislation that Congress passed, the National Defense Authorization Act, it was President Trump's responsibility, his duty, to see that U.S. tax dollars did not go to Ukraine unless they were making progress in reducing corruption. Is that also right?
Yes, that's right.
And isn't it true that Joe Biden's son, Hunter, had placed himself right smack dab in the middle of that corruption?
Yes, he did. Burisma was one of the most corrupt companies in Ukraine.
And contrary to what House Democrats and many in the media would have you believe, the concerns about Hunter Biden's involvement in Ukrainian corruption, they're not some sort of vast right-wing conspiracy concocted by supporters of the president, are they? In fact, the concerns about Hunter Biden were first raised by the Obama administration. Is that right?
That's right. And also Washington Post, a lot of publications, and the State Department.
And the Obama administration's concerns about Biden didn't end there, did they? The former ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, said she was coached by the Obama administration on how to answer pesky questions related to Hunter Biden and Burisma that might arise during her Senate confirmation process. Is that right?
The State Department was so concerned about this, they gave her a mock Q&A on this question.
And nearly every single witness who testified at the Intelligence Committee impeachment inquiry agreed that Hunter Biden's Burisma deal created, at the very least, the appearance of conflict of interest. Is that correct?
That's correct. And, you know, Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent testified that there was an investigation into Burisma, into their head, Zochevsky, and they were trying to track down $23 million that he had taken out of the country. They were working with the United Kingdom. They were working, United States, United Kingdom. Ukraine was working on tracking this money down. And there was an investigation, an active investigation going on, and a bribe was paid. And that bribe was paid. It allowed Zlochevsky to get off scot-free. Right around that time is when Burisma went about sprucing up their board, shall we say.
And yet, with all that evidence, the Democrats on the Intelligence Committee under Chairman Schiff, and now the Democrats here, are determined to sweep the Biden corruption under the rug, ignore it, not let us call witnesses on it, and instead rush to impeach the president, all to satisfy, I would argue, their radical left-wing base. What a disservice to the country. Imagine this. You've got the Vice President, Joe Biden, in charge of overseeing our Ukrainian policy, and his son, Hunter Biden, receiving $50,000 a month with no identifiable expertise in either energy or Ukraine, yet the Democrats won't let us present witnesses on that. So let's do the next best thing since we can't bring the witnesses here. Let's watch a couple of videos.
You didn't have any extensive knowledge about natural gas or Ukraine itself, though?
No.
The list that you gave me of the reasons why you're on that board, you did not list the fact that you were the son of the vice president.
Yeah, no.
What role do you think that played?
I think that it is impossible for me to be on any of the boards that I just mentioned without saying that I'm the son of the Vice President of the United States.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of Burisma?
I don't know. I don't know. Probably not.
You know, Joe Biden got a little testy with a voter at one of his events in Iowa last week, calling the man a liar, challenging him to a push-up contest, among other things, and falsely stating once again that nobody said there was anything wrong with his son's deal in Ukraine. Well, you know what? That's a lot of malarkey. A lot of people have been saying that for quite a while now, and they're right. And what's worse is that first the Intelligence Committee and now this committee are conducting an impeachment investigation against President Trump based on, as Professor Turley put it last week, wafer-thin evidence and ignoring evidence of a high-level U.S. official who actually did engage in a quid pro quo with the Ukrainian government, in fact, confessed to it in this video.
I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Oh, son of a bitch. Got fired.
You're investigating the wrong guy, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Goldman, I'd like to bring us back to the next president, not to this president, not the next president, and stay focused on the July 25 call and the president's abuse of office for his benefit and no one else's. Now, as my colleague, Ms. Jackson-Lee, confirmed, the president's request for these investigations was not an objective of U.S. foreign policy, correct?
That's right.
Is there any evidence that the National Security Council wanted an investigation into the Bidens, Burisma, or any alleged Ukrainian interference in 2016?
No.
Any evidence about the State Department wanting them?
No.
How about the DOD? Did the DOD want those investigations?
No evidence of that.
Did any witness tell you that they wanted Ukraine to investigate the Bidens of the 2016 election?
No.
And we certainly know now that the Ukrainians did not want it either. In fact, they made it very clear they did not want to be an instrument, this is a quote, an instrument in Washington domestic re-election politics. So the only person who was a beneficiary from that investigation is President Trump. And that's why everyone on the July 25 call knew it was wrong. They knew it was wrong. The investigative committee heard testimony from 3 witnesses who participated in that call. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, listen to that call.
Right. Mr. Goldman, even in real time, the witnesses who listened on that call testified they were concerned by the call. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, both Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Mr. Morrison immediately reported the call to legal counsel. Is that right?
That's right.
And why did they do so?
They did it for separate reasons. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was concerned about the substance of the call, that it was improper. Mr. Morrison was concerned about the potential political ramifications if the call was released because of the substance of the call and the political nature of the call.
And they reported the call, that they actually reported that to the internal legal channels. Mr. Goldman, I've placed Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's testimony about why he reported the call on the screen. Am I correct his concern was based on the fact that the President was asking a foreign power to investigate a U.S. citizen?
Yes, and he was not the only witness to express that concern.
Am I also correct that he reported this concern because he thought it was a sense of duty, a duty that he felt something was wrong?
Yes, as you probably know, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is a Purple Heart Award winner from, or medal winner from Iraq, and he has been in the Department of Defense for 20 years and has a great sense of duty and a great patriotism to this country, and felt that he compelled to follow that sense of duty and report it.
And Ms. Williams, Vice President Pence's aide, was present for the call, and she testified, as you brought out, or was brought out earlier, that it was unusual and inappropriate. Is that correct?
That's right.
Now, when Mr. Vice President Biden got involved with the European Union and the IMF and Germany and France and said, you've got to do something about corruption, that was okay because they were doing something for the common good of a bunch of people, as distinguished from what's going on here, where somebody's doing it for their personal good. Is that not correct?
Right. There's a distinction between doing an official act for an official purpose and doing an official act for a personal purpose. And if I could just respond to something Mr. Castor said, when he said that there were problems because Zlochevsky paid a bribe, the head of Burisma, in order to get out from under the prosecution, that was exactly the type of conduct that Vice President Biden wanted to shut down in Ukraine. That was exactly the type of non-anti-corruption policies that Vice President Biden was objecting to, using the official policy. So that's one of the reasons that I don't know if that was one, but that's the type of thing that he and the Americans and the Europeans based.
That's the issue we've got to get in this committee, to understand the difference between doing something for the national good, for the international good, for the common good, and for your own good. That's the difference. Got to get that across. And those witnesses, many career nonpartisan officials, were clear they thought it was wrong to ask a foreign government to investigate a political rival. Video.
To investigate the Vice President of the United States or someone who is a U.S. official, I don't think we should be asking foreign governments to do that. I would also say that's true of a political rival.
It is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent.
It was improper and it was inappropriate, and we said that in real time.
Again, our holding up of security assistance that would go to a country that is fighting aggression from Russia for no good policy reason, no good substantive reason, no good national security reason is wrong.
And we are going to check that type of conduct. We are the people's house. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gomer.
Well, I had some questions for the witness, Mr. Burke, but he has absconded. So I'm going to use my 5 minutes, but not to ask questions. It is interesting, though, to have heard Mr. Goldman refuse to answer a question about the investigation, yet he comes in here, and the very reason that he wants to see the president for the first time any president's ever been removed from office, why, he's been obstructing. He didn't answer our questions. So perhaps if we're going to apply his sense of justice to him, it would be time to have him removed from his position. But that's only if we apply his own standards. And as Chris Plant said, if it weren't for double standards, some of these folks wouldn't have standards at all. But we were told also at the beginning that we would hear lawyers present evidence. Lawyers are going to come in here. Now, what normally happens, and I've been in some kangaroo hearings in courts, not my own when I was there, but I have been mistreated in hearings before, but I have never seen anything like this where we don't allow the fact witnesses to come in here. We have the lawyers come in and tell us what we're supposed to know about those witnesses and about their testimony and about their impression and what the law is. This is outrageous. My friend Jim Sensenbrenner said in 41 years, he's never seen anything like what we have going on here to try to oust a sitting president. And it's also outrageous to hear people say, well, this man thought he was a king because he said he could do anything he wanted, when they know that that statement was in the context of whether or not he could fire Mueller. And of course he could fire Mueller. He could fire or not fire Mueller. He could appoint a special prosecutor to invest Mueller and Weissman. I think he should have. But that's his prerogative, and he could have done anything about that he wanted. To take that out of context, say he thinks he's a king. Let me tell you what a king is. A king is someone who says over 20 times, I can't do that. Congress has to change the law on immigration. And then he decides, you know what? I got a pen, I got a phone, I'll do whatever I want. And by golly, he does. He makes new law with a pen and a phone. Now that is more like a monarchy, not somebody saying they can fire a special prosecutor if they want to. And regarding treason, the Constitution itself says you got to have 2 witnesses. And that's not hearsay witnesses, none of this stuff that wouldn't be admissible in any decent court. No, that's 2 direct evidence witnesses that can come in and positively identify themselves, not something they overheard or something, but actually be witnesses to treason. And yet this group comes in here, they toss treason out in a report like it's no big deal. We can bring in a bunch of hearsay witnesses, and then we'll have the lawyers testify and then throw a president out of office. This is so absurd. It's so absurd. Now, we have a witness come in, and we're told he's going to be a witness. That's why he doesn't have to follow under the rules of decorum. And then, I've never seen this, he gets to come up and grill his opposing adversary witness. I feel like, to be fair, if we were going to make this thing fair, Mr. Castor would be able to come up and grill Mr. Burke. But this isn't about being fair. It's not about due process. This is about a kangaroo system. And let me tell you, those that think you've done something special here, you have set the bar so low, I'm afraid it's irreparable. I mean, just think, we've had people already mention, the next president, Joe Biden. We're told, gee, he may be the next president. Well, we've already got the forms. All we have to do is eliminate Donald Trump's name and put Joe Biden's name in there because he's on video, he and his son. He basically has admitted to the crime that's being hoisted on the president improperly. So I'm scared for my country because I've never seen anything like this. This is supposed to be the Congress. I came up here from a court where we had order and we had rules, and I've seen nothing of the kind in here today, and it's outrageous that we're trying to remove a president with a kangaroo court like this. I yield back.
Chairman, if I could just clarify, treason is not in our report. I just want to...
The gentleman,
The-
the gentleman yielded back.
Yeah, and it is mentioned in the report we got. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yielded back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get us back to the undisputed facts of the president's abuse of power. Mr. Goldman, as a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, when you prosecuted drug conspiracy cases, was it standard practice for drug kingpins to try to beat the case by distancing themselves from the conspiracy and blaming their accomplices for the crime?
All the time. Conspiracies have different layers, and the top layers make the bottom layers do the work so that they're further removed from the actual conduct.
Okay, I'd like to ask some questions about the president's role in what Ambassador Bolton referred to as a drug deal. Did the testimony and evidence compiled by the Intelligence Committee establish the fact that, with respect to Ukraine, Rudy Giuliani was at all times working on behalf of President Trump?
Yes, Mr. Giuliani said that. President Trump said that to a number of other individuals. And then those individuals, Ambassador Sondland, Ambassador Volker, also said that.
Thank you. And on May 9th, 2019, Rudy Giuliani, on behalf of his client, President Trump, spoke with a New York Times reporter about his planned trip to Ukraine. And on that trip, he planned to meet with President Zelensky, he said, and urged him to pursue investigations relating to the Bidens and to the debunked theory that Ukraine and not Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
And Mr. Giuliani told the reporter that his trip was not about official U.S. foreign policy and that the information he sought would be very, very helpful to his client, meaning it would be helpful to President Trump. Is that correct?
Yes, and if it's not official foreign policy, it would be helpful to President Trump's personal interests.
That's correct. And there is no doubt, Mr. Goldman, that investigations of the Bidens and the 2016 election meddling were, in fact, not about U.S. policy, but were about benefiting Trump's reelection, correct?
Yes, and even the Ukrainians realize that.
And on July 25th, President Trump placed that fateful phone call to President Zelensky, and he asked President Zelensky to investigate the Bidens, correct?
Yes.
And on that call, President Trump told Zelensky, quote, "I will have Mr. Giuliani to give you a call," correct?
That's right.
And on October 2nd and October 3rd, President Trump once again made explicit that he and Mr. Giuliani were intent on making these investigations happen, correct?
Yes.
And just so you know,
and
we've been investigating on a personal basis through Rudy and others, lawyers, corruption in the 2016 election.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
Mr. Goldman, the evidence shows a course of conduct by President Trump and his agents, does it not?
It does, and clearly it continued long after our investigation began.
It shows a common plan, correct?
That's right, yes.
It shows a common goal.
Correct.
And the goal was to get foreign help for the 2020 election, correct?
That's what all the witnesses said.
And Mr. Goldman, who was the kingpin of that plan?
President Trump.
Thank you, Mr. Goldman. Ambassador Bolton called it a drug deal. As a kingpin, President Trump tried to force a foreign government to interfere in the upcoming presidential election. The evidence is undisputed and overwhelming that Rudy Giuliani acted as part of a conspiracy with President Trump to obtain Ukrainian help for President Trump in the 2020 election. This was not just a hurtful drug deal. This was an attempt to undermine the very fabric of our democracy. The framers feared most how foreign influence could turn a president into a despot. So they adopted impeachment as a backstop to protect our democracy. The facts, ladies and gentlemen, demand that we use that remedy today. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, I want to go to the document that started it all, the August 12th whistleblower complaint. Bullet point 1 on page 1 of the whistleblower's complaint, he says this: over the past 4 months, more than half a dozen U.S. officials have informed me of the various facts related to this effort. Mr. Castor, who are these half a dozen U.S. officials?
We don't know.
We don't know, do we? We had no chance to know for sure who these people were because we never got to talk to the whistleblower. Is that right, Mr. Castor?
That's right.
We needed to talk to the guy who started it all. We needed to talk to him to figure out who these more than half a dozen people were who formed the basis of his complaint, and we never got to. Adam Schiff's staff got to. Adam Schiff knows who he is, but we don't get to know, and therefore we don't get to know the original people, the 6 people who formed the basis of this entire thing we've been going through now for 3 months. But we did talk to 17 people, right, Mr. Castor?
That's right.
17 depositions, and you were in every single one. You were the lawyer doing the work for the Republicans in every single one. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And there's one witness who they relied on and built their report around. One witness. Who would that witness be? As I read their report, it's obviously one witness. Who's that witness, Mr.
Ambassador
Castor?
Sondland.
Ambassador Sondland. I think you said earlier his name was mentioned, I don't know, what did you say?
611 times.
611 times. More than Lieutenant Colonel Venman, the guy who was on the call. More than Ambassador Taylor, their first witness, their star witness, the very first hearing in the Intelligence Committee. They relied on Sondland, not the whistleblower, not the more than half a dozen people who informed the whistleblower. They relied on Ambassador Sondland. Why'd they pick Sondland, Mr. Castor?
That's probably the best they got.
Because that's the best they got. The guy who had to file an addendum to his testimony, the guy that had to file the clarification, the guy who said 2 weeks ago, sitting in the same chair you're sitting in, Mr. Castor, in his 23-page opening statement, he said this: unless President Zelensky announces an investigation into Burisma and the Bidens, there would be no call with President Trump, there'd be no meeting with President Trump, there'd be no security assistance money going to Ukraine. That's what Ambassador Sondland said. Mr. Castor, was there an announcement by President Zelensky about investigating the Bidens or Burisma?
No.
No announcement.
No.
Did President Zelensky get a call from President Trump?
Yes.
Did President Zelensky get a meeting with President Trump?
Yes.
Did President Zelensky get the money from the United States?
Yes.
They got the call on July 25th. They got the money on September 11th. They got the meeting on September 25th. Is that right?
Yes.
But the guy who said none of that was going to happen is the guy they built their case around.
Yes.
Is that right, Mr. Sondland?
Yep.
Let me go to one other thing they built their case around. They built their case around a lot of hearsay, didn't they? And the best example of the hearsay, surprisingly enough, is Ambassador Sondland. It's amazing. They built their case around this ambassador, and they built their case around hearsay, and the best example of both is Mr. Sondland, Ambassador Sondland, because he filed his addendum, his clarification, where he says this. We read this a couple weeks ago. We pointed this out a couple weeks ago. He says this in bullet point number 2. In his clarification, he says, Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on a September 1st, 2019, in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. That's his clarification. Amazing. 6 people, as I said before, having 4 conversations in one sentence. Ambassador Taylor recalls that Mr. Morrison told Ambassador Taylor that I told Mr. Morrison that I conveyed this message to Mr. Yarmouk on September 1st, 2019, in connection with Vice President Pence's visit to Warsaw and a meeting with President Zelensky. That's the clarification. That's their star witness who they built their case around. So-and-so tells so-and-so what somebody said to someone else, and there you have it. That's their case. They forget the 4 key facts. They forget the fact that we have the call transcript and there was no quid pro quo. They forget the fact the 2 guys on the call, President Trump and President Zelensky, have said repeatedly there was no pressure, no linkage, no pushing. They forget the fact Ukraine didn't even know aid was held at the time of the call. And they forget the fact, most important, they did nothing to get the aid released, no announcement of any type of investigation whatsoever. They forget all that, those key facts. And they build their case around the guy who had to clarify his testimony with that amazing sentence. Mr. Goldman, did the Democrats publish phone records of the president's attorney?
Mr. Giuliani, yes.
Did the Democrats publish phone records of a member of the press?
Yes, who was also involved in this.
Did the Democrats publish phone records of a member of Congress?
Yes, who was talking to people involved.
Did the Democrats, does that member of Congress also happens to be your boss's political opponent that those phone records were published of? So the Democrats, they run this kind of investigation, ignoring the facts, not letting the whistleblower come in, and therefore not letting us know if we've talked to the more than half a dozen original sources for the whistleblower's complaint in the first place. The guy has to file an addendum with that clarification sentence. But one thing they did do in their report is they published the phone records of the president's personal lawyer, the phone records of a member of the press, and the phone records of the chairman of the Intelligence Committee's political opponent, Representative Nunes. That's what these guys did. And that's their effort to impeach the President of the United States 11 months before an election.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to focus on the facts surrounding the President's abuse of power.
Gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the report by the majority staff of the House Committee on the Judiciary Constitutional Grounds for Presidential Impeachment that talks about treason and bribery be admitted for the record.
Be what?
Be made part of our record.
Majority report without objection.
Thanks.
Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you. Getting back to the facts surrounding the President's abuse of power using the White House meeting as leverage for helping his political campaign. Mr. Goldman, President Trump offered Ukrainian President Zelensky a meeting in the White House. But first, he wanted investigations into the Bidens and a conspiracy theory about meddling in the 2016 election. You testified that the committees found evidence that President Trump worked to exchange official actions for personal benefit, and I want to talk about that. On May 23rd, 2019, a delegation of officials returned from Zelensky's inauguration, and they briefed the president. In that briefing, President Trump directed government officials to work with his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And Trump's hand-picked Ukraine operator, Gordon Sondland, testified that they faced a choice: either work with Giuliani or abandon the goal of a White House meeting. What choice did they make, Mr. Goldman?
They decided to work with Mr. Giuliani.
Right. And 6 days later, on May 29th, President Trump sent the new Ukrainian president a letter that said America stood with Ukraine and invited President Zelensky to visit the White House. Isn't that correct?
Yes, that was the second time that he invited him to the White House.
So at this point, the Ukrainian president expected that meeting.
Correct.
But then they learned that they've got to do something more for the president. Sondland testified that there was a prerequisite of investigations. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And NSC staffer Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that Sondland told the Ukrainians in a July 10th meeting that investigation of the Bidens was a deliverable necessary to get that meeting. Isn't that right?
Yes, and if I could just take a second to correct what Mr. Castor said about that meeting, there really is no inconsistent statements about whether or not Ambassador Sondland raised the issue of investigations in connection to the White House. Even Ambassador Volker, in his public testimony, was forced to admit that he did hear that, and he said it was inappropriate.
And in fact, on July 19th, Sondland told President Zelensky directly that President Trump wanted to hear a commitment to the investigations on the July 25th call, correct?
That's right.
That same day, Sondland updated multiple Trump administration officials that Zelensky was, quote, prepared to receive POTUS's call and would offer assurances about the investigations. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And on that same day, State Department official Volker had breakfast with Rudy Giuliani, and he reported to Sondland by text message, most important is for Zelensky to say he will help investigation, right?
Yes, and address any specific personnel issues.
Right. And later that day, after Giuliani spoke with Yermak, evidence suggested Giuliani gave a green light to that July 25th call. Then on the morning of the call, Volker texted Zelensky aide Yermak, and that text to his aide said, and I quote, heard from White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down a date for visit to Washington. And the transcript released by President Trump shows Trump requests investigations and Zelensky agrees. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and that text message was actually a direction, a message relayed from President Trump himself.
And then after the July 25th call, members of the administration continued to follow up with the Ukrainian counterparts to prepare for the announcement of investigations. Sondland texted Volker about efforts to schedule a White House visit, noting that POTUS really wants the deliverable. And that was just one of many messages during a flurry of follow-up activity. There were meetings and calls and texts on July 26th and July 27th and August 2nd, 4th, 5th, 7th, 8th, and 9th, August 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 15th. Mr. Goldman, August 16th, 17th, and August 19th, isn't that correct?
Yes, including to Secretary Pompeo as well.
Here's the point. These are our government officials who work for us. Instead, they were working hard to help the president advance his personal political interests. Isn't that what you found, Mr. Goldman?
That's right.
This isn't a close call. We had a Ukrainian president at war with Russia, desperate for a White House meeting. The president promised a White House meeting, but then he blocked the Oval Office. He blocked it and said, I need a favor. Not a favor to help America, a favor to help me get reelected. Our framers feared one day we would face a moment like this. They gave us an impeachment, and they gave us impeachment as a safety valve, not to punish the president, but to defend our elections and our Constitution, and that's what we must do. I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Buck.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Castor, I want to direct your attention to page 3 of the telephone call dated July 25th between President Trump and President Zelensky. On page 3, President Trump states, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. Later, he says, I would like to have the Attorney General call you or your people, and I would like you to get to the bottom of it. The majority report on page 13 says, the U.S. intelligence community had unanimously determined that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 election to help the candidacy of President Trump. Mr. Castor, there appears to be a conflict there. President Trump is asking the Ukraine to investigate something. The majority has decided that it's an illegitimate request because there was no interference in an election by the Ukraine. Is that how you read this?
Yes.
And the press release from the majority on their report says, as part of this scheme, President Trump, acting in his official capacity and using his position of public trust, personally and directly requested that the President of Ukraine, that the government of Ukraine publicly announce investigations into, subsection 2, a baseless theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 U.S. election. Is that true?
Yes.
And Mr. Castor, I want to ask you something. Have you seen this article from Politico dated January 11, 2017?
Yes, I have.
And the title of that article is Ukrainian Efforts to Sabotage Trump Backfire. Is that correct?
Yes.
I want to read you the second paragraph. Ukrainian government officials tried to help Hillary Clinton and undermine Trump by publicly questioning his fitness for office. They also disseminated documents implicating a top Trump aide in corruption and suggested they were investigating the matter only to back away after the election. And they helped Clinton's allies research damaging information on Trump and his advisors, a Politico investigation found. Isn't it true that President Trump had a legitimate reason to request help from the Ukraine about the 2016 election? And I'm not suggesting for a minute that Russia didn't interfere. Of course they interfered. But the Ukraine officials tried to influence the election.
Yes.
Let's move on to Ambassador Sondland. I only have 10 fingers and 10 toes, so I can't count above 20, Mr. Castor. But you know how many times Ambassador Sondland said that he did not know, did not recall, had no recollection, had limited memory, or failed to remember something in his October 17th testimony? You know how many times? 325. Does that surprise you? 325.
Big number.
And then he files a clarifying statement, and he clarifies a few things, I guess. But did you have any contact with Ambassador Sondland between the time of his deposition and the time of his clarifying statement?
No.
Did the majority?
I have no idea.
You have no idea. So they may have had influence on his testimony.
I did.
And that would be evidence of bias. That would be evidence of credibility. That would be evidence that we should take into account before. But we'll never know, will we? Because the majority counsel has a right to assert a privilege as to information that's relevant to this committee's decision. The majority counsel has a right to assert a privilege in any communications he has with the chairman, Adam Schiff, doesn't he? As does minority counsel. That's a privilege that we've reserved here in Congress, isn't it? Yeah. And the same thing is true of FOIA. The Freedom of Information Act does not apply to memos that majority counsel writes. Isn't that true?
Correct.
So we've demanded that of the executive branch, but we have allowed ourselves not to be part of FOIA, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so the majority has a privilege. The president also has a privilege. It's called executive privilege. He can meet with the Secretary of State, and that's a privileged conversation. He can meet with the Secretary of Defense. That's a privileged conversation. He can meet with the Secretary of Energy. That's a privileged conversation. Now, when the majority has subpoenaed those witnesses, and the president has refused to produce those witnesses or relevant documents, or what they consider relevant documents, they are charging him with an article of impeachment for obstruction. In fact, their report says, President obstructed the impeachment inquiry by instructing witnesses to ignore subpoenas. Why?
Ms. Bass.
Mr. Goldman, I want to pick up on the president using the powers of his office, in this case, in a meeting at the White House, to pressure a foreign country to investigate his political rival. Now that you've had time to step back from the investigation, is there any doubt that the president did, in fact, use a White House visit to pressure President Zelensky to announce investigations of his political rival to benefit his re-election campaign?
I will answer that question in a minute, but I would like just to comment to Mr. Buck that the majority staff and no one had any contact with Ambassador Sondland after his deposition. But the answer to your question is yes, Ms. Bass.
My colleague, Mr. Deutsch, mostly focused on the period prior to the July 25th call. I'd like to focus on the period after. Following the call, did President Zelensky come to the White House for a meeting?
No, he's never come to the White House, and several witnesses, multiple witnesses, said that there's a huge distinction between a White House meeting and a meeting on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly where they did meet on September 25th.
So has a White House meeting been scheduled?
No.
So did the president and his associates essentially continue to withhold the White House meeting? And if so, why did they do that?
Well, the evidence found that the White House meeting was conditioned on the announcement of these investigations. And so once in mid-August, when the Ukrainians, Mr. Yermak and President Zelensky, decided that they were not going to issue that statement that Rudy Giuliani wanted to include Burisma in the 2016 elections, there was no White House meeting. It soon became clear to them that the security assistance was also at risk, and that took on a renewed importance for them.
Well, following the 25th call, the July 25th call, Ambassadors Sondland and Volker worked closely with Mr. Giuliani and the Ukrainians to help draft a statement that the president could make, President Zelensky. Wasn't that right?
Yes, and the report say they work closely, and then there were also phone calls with the White House around the same time that they were working closely.
Do you know what that statement was supposed to say, according to Mr. Giuliani and the U.S. officials?
Well, the key difference is that it had to include that Ukraine would do the investigations of Burisma, which equaled the Biden investigation, and the 2016 Ukraine interference.
But was there concern about doing the investigations, or what? Were they just supposed to make a statement about it? What?
Ambassador Sondland very clearly testified that all he ever heard Mr. Giuliani or anyone say is that they only needed the public announcement of the investigations.
And so did the committee find that without that public statement that there would be no White House meeting?
Yes.
So I was struck by how clear the evidence seems to be on this point, and I'd like to play another example.
Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. Everyone was in the loop.
Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committees find that Mr. Giuliani played a role in the White House visit being conditioned on investigations?
The evidence showed that Mr. Giuliani not only played a role, but that he was essentially the president's agent. He was acting on behalf of the president, expressing the president's wishes, desires.
So what evidence did the committee find that corroborated the quote, "everyone was in the loop"?
Well, Ambassador Sondland produced for his public testimony, and I think it's very important in light of the testimony from Mr. Castor a minute ago with Mr. Buck as to how many times that Mr. Sondland did not remember in his deposition, because we agree it was egregious. But the advantage of doing closed depositions is that Mr. Sondland could not match up his testimony. So as other witnesses came in, then he realized that he had to actually admit to more and more stuff. So he did admit to an email that included Secretary Pompeo, Mulvaney.
I do want to make a point before my time goes out. We have to think about what is going on today. So President Zelensky is meeting with Putin today. And because of President Trump's actions, Zelensky is in a weakened position to negotiate with the leader of the nation that invaded his country. If our military assistance had been provided as Congress ordered it and the White House meeting, President Zelensky would be meeting with Putin from a position of strength. If you want the support, well, we have to realize that the message that this sends to our allies is to our standing in the world. If you want the support of the United States, be prepared to help with President Trump's reelection. President Trump's abuse of power has injured our nation.
Thank the chairman. The 299-page Democratic majority report mentions the Intelligence Community Inspector General Michael Atkinson on pages 26, 33, 138, 140, and 143. Mr. Goldman, you were present for the October 4, 2019 transcribed interview of the Inspector General Michael Atkinson, correct?
Yes.
On pages 53 to 73 of that transcribed interview, the Inspector General's testimony confirms the following: that the whistleblower made statements to the Inspector General under penalty of perjury that were not true and correct. That the whistleblower first made statements in writing under penalty of perjury that were not true and correct. The whistleblower then made statements under penalty of perjury that were not true and correct in his or her verbal responses to the Inspector General's investigative team. Because of the whistleblower's statements in writing and verbally to the Inspector General that were neither true, correct, or accurate, pages 53 to 73 of that sworn testimony reveal that the Inspector General was not able to answer any questions, none from me, about the whistleblower's contact or communication with Chairman Schiff's staff, of which Mr. Goldman is a member. Mr. Castor, do you remember anywhere in this 299-page report that makes reference to the fact that when the whistleblower started this inquiry, he or she did so by making statements under penalty of perjury that were neither true or correct in writing, and then did so again verbally?
I don't remember that.
After the Inspector General testified on October 4th, and after media reports revealed that the whistleblower and Chairman Schiff did not disclose their prior contacts or communications with one another, the whistleblower contacted the Inspector General to explain why he or she made statements under penalty of perjury in writing and verbally that were not true, correct, and accurate. Mr. Castor, is that communication from the whistleblower to the Inspector General to explain prior inconsistent statements reflected anywhere in the 299-page report?
No.
On October 2nd, Chairman Schiff's spokesman, Patrick Bolin, acknowledged publicly that the outlines of the whistleblower's accusations against the president had been disclosed to the House intelligence staff and shared with Chairman Schiff. Mr. Castor, is that disclosure and Mr. Bolin's admission of that disclosure anywhere in this report?
I don't remember seeing it.
It's not. I think all members of Congress should be held accountable during this impeachment process. And to that end, if I have made any false statements about the whistleblower or the Inspector General's testimony today, then I should be held accountable. The way to do that would be to release the Inspector General's testimony, or even just pages 53 to 73. I would add that there's nothing in those pages that would in any way identify or place at risk the whistleblower's identity, nor would it reveal any information that in any way relates to, much less jeopardizes, national security. Look, Maybe there's a believable explanation for why the whistleblower made statements that weren't true or accurate about his contact or her contact with Chairman Schiff in writing and then again verbally. Maybe there's a good explanation for why the words Congress or Congressional Committee was confusing or not clear to the whistleblower. Maybe there's a good explanation for why the whistleblower also misled the Inspector General in writing on August 12th by stating, "I reserve the option to exercise my legal right to contact the committees directly," when the whistleblower had in fact already contacted Chairman Schiff's committee 2 weeks before he or she wrote that. Maybe there's a believable reason why Chairman Schiff was not initially truthful about his staff's communications with the whistleblower. Maybe there's a good reason that explains all of these statements in writing and verbally that just weren't true and correct. Maybe there is, but there is no good reason for voting to impeach and remove from office an American president without allowing a single question to be asked of a single witness to get an explanation for why the Inspector General was not told the truth about contacts between the whistleblower and Chairman Schiff. The bottom line is we should all be held accountable, and next November, every member of the House will be asked this question: did you vote to impeach the president without allowing any investigation into why the whistleblower that started it all did so by making statements in writing and verbally under penalty of perjury that were not true? Democrats may not care if that question ever gets answered, but the voters will. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman, I want to start off with facts that you all uncovered through the course of your investigation. And I want to pick up where my colleagues, Mr. Deutsch and Ms. Bass, left off. They walked us through how the president used the White House visit to apply pressure on Ukraine to do his personal bidding. I want to talk about how the president did the same thing with almost 400 million taxpayer dollars to pressure Ukraine to do his personal bidding. So I'd like to start with turning back to the July 25th call. It's a fact that in the president's own words in the transcript submitted by him, reveals that after Ukraine asked for military aid, Trump says, "I would like you to do us a favor, though."
Right after President Zelensky thanks President Trump for the military assistance, then President Trump asked for a favor. And of course, by this point, President Trump had already placed the hold on the security assistance.
Now, my Republican colleagues have suggested that the Ukrainians did not even know about the military aid being withheld. Is that true?
No, there was significant evidence that even as early as July 25th, at the time of this call, that Ukrainian officials had suspected that the aid was being withheld. And there was a New York Times article actually last week that wasn't included in our report, but from the former deputy foreign minister who said that Ukraine, President Zelensky's office received a diplomatic cable from the embassy here the week of July 25th saying that the aid had been held.
Correct. And what I also show you on the screen is that it was on July 25th also, the same day of the call, that the State Department emailed the Department of Defense noting that the Ukrainian embassy was asking about the withheld military aid.
Yes, that's what I was referring to.
I'd like to let's go back. There was also discussion earlier during the minority questioning that Mr. Sandy from OMB said that the reason for the security assistance hold was related to the president's concerns about burden sharing with Europe. Is that consistent with the evidence that you all uncovered?
So it's a good question because Mr. Sandy did say that, but notably, Mr. Sandy said that he only heard that in early September, that reason was never provided to him or anybody else before early September for the first 2 months of the hold. And of course, it was given at that point as the gig was up, so to speak.
So that was after everything came out to light?
He wasn't sure of the timing, but he was ultimately told that the reason for the hold after it was lifted was for that reason. But that's, I think an after-the-fact excuse based on our evidence because no other witnesses were ever told of that reason during the entire time that it was held.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record evidence uncovered by the committee from the House Budget and Appropriations Committees that documents OMB placing a hold on the Ukrainian security assistance on July 25th.
Without objection.
So let's review. On July 18th, OMB announced to all relevant agencies that the military aid would be withheld from Ukraine. On a call with Ukraine on July 25th, President Trump says, "Do us a favor, though, and ask Ukraine to investigate his political rival." Also on July 25th, in the hours following that call, both the Ukrainians and the Americans took action specifically related to that military aid. The Ukrainians began asking about the status of their military aid, and OMB took its first official action to withhold that aid. Mr. Goldman, I'm placing on the screen in front of you an email from Ambassador Sondland to members of the White House administration, in which Ambassador Sondland says, "I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to the President and the United States. Hopefully, that will break the logjam." Did the investigative committees uncover any evidence on what Ambassador Sondland meant when he suggested that President Zelensky would have to move forward publicly on, quote, issues of importance to the President to receive military aid?
Ambassador Sondland said those were the two investigations that President Trump mentioned on the July 25th call, which Secretary Pompeo, who received that email, listened into.
So the President was concerned about the two investigations, and though that was the predicate for releasing military aid to our ally.
At the time of that email, yes.
Thank you, and I yield back.
A little earlier, Mr. Armstrong had asked a unanimous consent request to insert into the record the IG report released today about FISA, and I had said we would take it under advisement. We have reviewed it, and without objection, it will be entered into the record. Ms. Roby.
I'm actually stunned by the process or lack thereof that is taking place in this institution. I have many Democratic friends that I know to be thoughtful, deliberative members of Congress, even though we may disagree vehemently on policy. But these proceedings being led by the majority, like I said, it's stunning. I cannot for the life of me figure out why the majority would approach this in such a way that will forever cast doubt on why and how they chose to affect history with the impeachment of a president of the United States. And now to what has taken place here today. This is just bizarre. As a member of Congress serving on the House Judiciary Committee, I'm asking questions to staff as witnesses before us in an impeachment evidentiary hearing. I mean, no disrespect to staff. We have the most dedicated, hardworking staff, and without these individuals, we most certainly couldn't do our jobs effectively. But we have not and we will not hear from any fact witnesses. Whether you identify as a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, whether you agree or disagree with the president, whether you like or dislike a president, the American people should feel cheated by the way this is all taking place. This process is more than incomplete, and the American people deserve better. Today, history is being made, and I too believe it is a dangerous precedent for the future of our republic. It is worth a deeper explanation of the issue of a minority hearing. The minority members of this committee have frequently asked the chairman for a minority day hearing, and all members on this side have signed onto a letter to the chairman asking for a minority day hearing. I'd like to quote House Rule 11, Clause 2, "Whenever a hearing is conducted by a committee on a measure or a matter, the minority members of the committee shall be entitled, upon the request to the chair by a majority of them before the completion of the hearing, to call witnesses selected by the minority to testify with respect to that measure or matter during at least 1 day of hearing thereon." The wording here is that the minority shall be entitled, not if the chairman deems the minority worthy, but shall be entitled. Mr. Castor, with all of your experience in investigations here in the Congress, is it your belief based on that experience, that ignoring the minority's stated rights for a hearing under the rules of the House severely undermines the future of this institution.
Yes.
I'd like to quote what we heard from the Democratic staff, Mr. Burke, in his opening comments. It is the hope that in these discussions, we can put aside political rancor, disagreement, and have a fair discussion. That is far from what has happened here today or the days leading up to this. The American people deserve better than this. And I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Collins.
Thank you. Mr. Castor, we've heard a lot. It's always a good time, I think, to go back and remind people that there are 4 things that really haven't changed. Would you like to at least remind us about everything that's been discussed?
Well, there's 4 things that will never change, and that is the transcript is complete and accurate. It shows no quid pro quo, no conditionality. That's number 1. Number 2, there was no pressure. Both Zelensky and Trump have said that repeatedly. President Zelensky said that at the United Nations on September 25th. He said it in subsequent news articles on October 6th and October 10th and December 1st. Number 3, the Ukrainians and Zelensky did not know about the pause in aid, at the very least, at the time of the call. And number 4, no investigations were announced, the aid was released, and the White House, afforded a meeting, and then President Trump met with Zelensky in New York.
Do you find it amazing that the majority, one of their key prongs of this whole thing is that they're making the elected leader of the Ukraine out to be a liar? Because if he says that there's no pressure, he's done it on many, many occasions since then, that undoubtedly they believe him not to be truthful. So doesn't that strike you as a little strange, especially in this circumstance?
It's unfortunate.
It is. It's sad that we're calling an elected leader who is actually working on corruption and other things like that, we're calling him a liar simply because they don't agree with the Democrats' theory of a partisan impeachment. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Jeffries.
Let's focus on the aid to Ukraine. Mr. Goldman, Congress allocated on a bipartisan basis $391 million in military aid to the Ukraine. Is that correct?
Yes, and it was signed by President Trump into law.
Does the record establish that the military aid to Ukraine is in the national security interests of the United States?
Absolutely.
The investigation concluded that President Trump compromised U.S. national security by withholding vital military assistance and diplomatic support. Is that true?
Yes.
President Trump and his defenders claim that he withheld military aid out of alleged concern with corruption in Ukraine. Let's explore this phony justification. Donald Trump first spoke to the president of Ukraine on an April 21st call, correct?
That's right.
President Trump never used the word corruption on that April 21st call, true?
That is true, and the readout from the White House after the call did say that President Trump talked about corruption.
That readout was inaccurate. In a May 23rd letter, Trump's Department of Defense concluded that Ukraine met the anti-corruption benchmarks required to receive military aid from the United States, true?
Yes, and if I could just take a second to talk about that, because that's very important, and this goes back to what Mr. Collins was talking about with Vice President Biden. There is absolutely conditionality on aid routinely in all sorts of different ways, but it's done through official policy. And these anti-corruption benchmarks that you're referencing here was a condition of Ukraine getting the aid. But in May, the Department of Defense, in conjunction with the other interagencies, certified that Ukraine was making the necessary progress on anti-corruption efforts to merit the aid.
And yet the aid was not released, correct?
The aid was subsequently held. It was supposed to be released. The DOD announced the release, and then President Trump held the aid without explanation.
Mr. Goldman, based on the evidence and testimony that you have reviewed, is there any reason to believe that the president cared about corruption in Ukraine?
No, the evidence really supports the fact that President Trump views corruption in Ukraine to be synonymous with the 2 investigations that he wants.
But what the president did care about was a political favor from the Ukrainian government, and that is why he withheld the military aid. True?
That he told Ambassador Sondland himself that that is the only thing that he cares about.
Now, several witnesses testified as to the real motivation connected to the withheld military aid, including Ambassador Bill Taylor. Here is what he said in his testimony.
To withhold that assistance for no good reason other than help with the political campaign made no sense. It was counterproductive to all of what we had been trying to do. It was illogical. It could not be explained. It was crazy.
Illogical, unexplainable, crazy. Mr. Goldman, according to the testimony from Ambassador Taylor, the only explanation for the withheld aid that made sense is that the president was seeking help with a political campaign, correct?
That is the only logical explanation, as multiple witnesses said.
Ambassador Sondland is a Trump appointee who gave $1 million to the president's inauguration, and he testified that he came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations, correct?
Yes, and that was subsequently confirmed in a conversation with President Trump himself.
Lieutenant Colonel Vindman is a decorated Iraq War veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and member of the White House National Security Council, and he testified that it is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent, correct?
Yeah, that was the pretty much unanimous view of all 17 witnesses that came in to testify before the Intelligence Committee.
The evidence shows that President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine as part of a scheme to extract a political favor and solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election. True?
Yes, and the scheme part is very important because the minority wants to focus on these 4 very narrow facts that ignore the vast majority of the evidence. And so the fact that you use scheme is actually critical to the whole case here.
The president abused his power. The president must be held accountable. No one is above the law. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gates.
The last public opinion poll I saw showed Congress had an approval rating at about 9%. By contrast, Muammar Gaddafi had an approval rating at 13%, and his own people dragged him in the streets and killed him. This impeachment process demonstrates the worst in us, and it is depriving us the opportunity to raise our gaze and meet the needs of the American people. Unless you have bipartisan consensus, impeachment is a divisive issue in the country. Many people would think it's being done for political reasons. Nancy Pelosi, May 2018. And here we are in the most partisan presidential impeachment in American history. Matter of fact, when we opened the inquiry, no Republicans voted with the Democrats, and you even had Democrats voting with us in the only bipartisan vote to shut down this impeachment. And that brings us to your role, Mr. Goldman. Are you here as a partisan advocate for the Democrat position, or are you here as a nonpartisan investigator of the facts?
I'm here to present the report that we did on our investigation, which was totally and completely reliant on the actual evidence that we uncovered, the witness testimony, and the documents.
Are you a partisan?
I'm not a partisan.
Mr. Castro, how long have you worked for the House?
Since 2005.
And same question, Mr. Goldman.
For the House? Since earlier this year.
Mr. Castro, do you make political donations?
I don't remember any.
Mr. Goldman, same question. Do you make political donations?
I do, sir. I think it's very important.
Matter of fact,
to support,
you've given tens of thousands of dollars to Democrats, right?
Sir, I think it's very important to support candidates for office. I think our free
Have you
and
given
fair
over 100,000 to Democrats? I just want to know the number. I don't really care the basis. Have you given more than 100,000 bucks to Democrats?
You don't care about it?
The basis. I just want the number. So it's tens of. I think
I
Mr.
don't know
Burke.
the number,
Do you know how much money Mr. Burke has given Democrats?
I don't know, and I don't.
Would it surprise you if it's more than 100,000?
Mr. Gates, I'm here to talk about this report.
So you gave tens of thousands, and Mr. Burke gave hundreds of, or more than 100,000. Do you think if you'd given more money, you might have been able to ask questions and answer them like Mr. Burke did? I guess it's something you're still pondering. Mr. Castro, have you ever tweeted anything at the president?
No.
Mr. Goldman, same question.
I have made a number of tweets in my private capacity before I came to this job when I was working in the media, yes.
Matter of fact, this is one of those tweets, right? And you said, Nothing in the dossier is proven false, but in fact, the dossier said that there was a Russian consulate in Miami when there isn't. The dossier said that Michael Cohen had a meeting in Prague when he didn't. The dossier said that Michael Cohen's wife was Russian. She's in fact Ukrainian. And so as we sit here today, where you've, I guess, got a tweet mentioning a P-tape, presenting yourself not as a partisan, hired by the Democrats to pursue the president, do you regret this tweet?
Sir, I would be happy to put this investigation up with any of the nonpartisan investigations.
I just want to know if you regret the tweet, Mr. Goldman.
During my 10 years as a federal prosecutor.
Do you regret it?
I hope you read the evidence, and I think you can judge
You
for
either
yourself
regret it or you
whether
don't
it's
regret it, Mr.
partisan or
Goldman.
not.
I guess you don't want to answer
It's
the
based
question. You know what, Mr.
entirely
Chairman?
on the evidence.
Earlier in this hearing, you said in your opening statement that there is nothing more urgent than impeachment right now. This is the most urgent thing we could possibly do. Well, you know what? If you're a senior right now and you can't afford your prescription drugs, that's more urgent than this. If you're a manufacturer wanting to dominate the Western Hemisphere with the passage of the USMCA, that is more urgent. If you're a farmer who wants to open markets so that your family can survive and thrive, that is a lot more urgent than this partisan process. If you're a desperate family member watching someone succumb to addiction, solving the opioid problem, probably more urgent than this partisan impeachment. If you're a member of the next generation, dealing with the challenges of extinction and climate change, a budget that's out of control, driving up the credit card of young people in this country and what they'll have to pay back as a consequence of our poor decisions, likely more urgent. But House Democrats have failed at all of these things. Matter of fact, I'd say the only thing under the Christmas tree for most Americans would be a lump of coal, but I think they're against coal too. The only thing under the Christmas tree for Americans would be impeachment and investigations. I've heard over and over Democrats say that this is all about the president's personal interest and that he abandoned the national interest. And it begs an analysis of how the nation is doing. In November, 266,000 jobs created, 80,000 over the average, 500,000 more manufacturing jobs in the Trump presidency, 700,000 construction jobs. We are doing better than ever before. The American people are thriving. Why won't you help us move along the critical issues that are far more important than your partisan impeachment?
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Cicilline.
Let me begin by dispelling the claim that Mr. Gates just made. This has been one of the most productive Congresses in modern history. We've passed nearly 400 pieces of legislation that respond to the urgent priorities of the American people, driving down health care costs, raising wages for the American worker, responding to gun violence, providing equal pay for equal work, responding to the climate crisis. 275 of those bills are fully bipartisan, and 80% of those bills are sitting on the Senate Majority Leader's desk awaiting action. So we will continue to deliver on the important priorities of the American people, but we were also elected to hold this president accountable. And we took an oath of office that said to protect and defend the Constitution, and that's what we're engaged in today. And so I want to return, Mr. Goldman, to the military aid. Did the investigating committees receive evidence about why the United States military aid to Ukraine was necessary? What was it advancing? Because a lot of Americans who are watching don't know a lot about Ukraine, don't know about the geopolitical significance. Like, why does it matter?
The witnesses were quite clear about this, and they say it mattered for multiple reasons. The first is that Russia invaded Ukraine to take over part of their country, and that this was the first military incursion in Europe since World War II. And this is Russia, who's an adversary, actually trying to encroach on another democracy. So just from a broad democratic viewpoint, it was essential not only to Ukraine's national security, but to America's national security to make sure that democracy remains worldwide.
And when that, prior to the call on July 25th, Congress had approved the aid, correct?
Congress had approved the aid, and then the president had held the aid.
And the Defense Department had even publicly announced its intention to deliver the aid, correct?
That's right.
The Trump administration had already certified that Ukraine had taken substantial steps to combat corruption, correct?
Correct.
And that normally leads to the release of the aid.
They announced the release of the aid, yes.
And the investigative committees questioned witnesses from the Defense Department, the State Department, OMB, the White House, and the National Security Council about the president's decision to withhold aid, correct?
Correct.
And I'd like to play a clip of some of that evidence.
From what you witnessed, did anybody in the national security community support withholding the assistance?
No.
I never heard anyone advocate for holding the aid.
And the entire interagency supported the continuation of the security assistance, isn't that right?
That is correct. I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support.
Am I correct that the witnesses that appeared before your committee confirmed that there was no credible explanation for withholding the military aid and that it was in fact against our national security interest to do so?
Everyone agreed it was against our national security interest to do so. The only explanation that any witness provided was Mr. Sandy, who said that he had heard from Rob Blair, I believe, the assistant to Mick Mulvaney, that the reason was because of other countries' donations or contributions to Ukraine. But that was only in September, and of course, there were no further commitments from any other country.
And as we heard from Bill Taylor, who's a graduate of West Point and a decorated combat veteran who served in Vietnam, Ukraine then and now is in an active war with the Russians. Russia stole part of their country in Crimea and has killed more than 10,000 Ukrainians, and weakening Ukraine would only benefit Russia. Here's what Ambassador Taylor said.
After our meeting with President Zelensky, Ambassador Volker and I traveled to the front line in northern Donbass to receive a briefing from the commander of forces on the line of contact. Arriving for the briefing in the military headquarters, the commander thanked us for the security assistance. But I was aware that this assistance was on hold, which made me uncomfortable. Ambassador Volker and I could see the armed and hostile Russian-led forces on the other side of the damaged bridge across the line of contact. Russian-led forces continue to kill Ukrainians in the war, 1 or 2 a week. More Ukrainians would undoubtedly die without the U.S. assistance.
Against the consensus of his own agencies and national security experts, the president used congressionally appropriated funds to advance his own political interests at the expense of our national security. This action is a threat to the integrity of our elections and the sanctity of our democracy. President Trump must not get away with this. No one in this country, no one, including the President of the United States, is above the law. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been a truly extraordinary and historically unprecedented hearing. It has frankly been an outrageous violation of due process, a series of violations of due process. In fact, let me review the past 7.5 hours. In the beginning of our proceedings today, I asked Chairman Nadler if Mr. Burke was appearing here as a staff member or as a witness, but the chairman gave strangely conflicting answers to that important question. When I objected under House Rule 17 that Mr. Burke was repeatedly and brazenly steamrolling over House decorum rules and using language that impugned the motives of the President of the United States and suggested he is disloyal to his country, Chairman Nadler insisted that those words could not be taken down and stricken from the record, saying, quote, "The rules don't apply here because Mr. Burke is merely appearing as a staffer." But later, Chairman Nadler stated the opposite and declared that Mr. Burke was appearing to present the Democrat member's report as their representative, which would of course mean that the member rules should apply. Then Mr. Burke was allowed to switch places and turn from witness to questioner. That's extraordinarily bizarre, of course, but it's entirely consistent with this whole impeachment circus. As everybody knows, Intel Chairman Adam Schiff was allowed in the opening act of this circus to serve as the judge, jury, prosecutor, witness coach, and case strategy chief all in one. So much for due process. Under the Democrats' haphazardly drawn special parameters for these special hearings, House Resolution 660, Mr. Burke was then allowed to join the elected members of Congress on this dais and ask 45 minutes of questions of his fellow witness, Mr. Castor. When he was argumentative, assumed critical facts not in evidence, engaged in speculation, and committed countless other violations of regular House rules and the federal rules of civil procedure, I objected, but was then ruled out of order by Chairman Nadler, who informed all of us that while House Resolution 660 specifically provides for objections, it lists none of them, and the Democrats have ignored every request of ours to obtain a list of what rules and objections would be enforced and applicable today. Again, so much for due process and fairness. A month ago, listen, a month ago, the Republican members of this committee formally requested all documents related to the impeachment investigation, but Chairman Nadler and Schiff withheld everything until, you know when? Saturday afternoon. That's right, less than 48 hours before this hearing, they dumped approximately 8,000 pages of documentation on us while we were back home in our districts. They intentionally made it literally impossible for us to review all material in any meaningful way, mere hours before this fateful hearing. What's worse is that the documents they decided to dump on us are not all of the underlying records we need to review, but rather only a partial, redacted, and biased subset of information that they think will advance their false narrative. And as has been mentioned here, we're being allowed no minority day hearing, which is required by regular House rules. Now, I'd love to cross-examine Mr. Burke himself, but Chairman Nadler's special and still mysterious rules for this hearing won't allow it. I notice he's disappeared from the hearing room. I would love to ask him under oath about his own biases. Because, you know, he hammered here over and over today the importance of fairness and objectivity and accuracy, and he insisted that everything here has to be unbiased. But if he was under oath here, he would be forced to admit that FEC records show that he has personally donated approximately $99,000 to Democrat candidates over the years, including sizable donations to Hillary Clinton for president, and also donated to past Trump opponents, including Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, and Kirsten Gillibrand. Mr. Burke appeared here as a fact witness and a finder of fact, but in our system, a finder of fact is supposed to be fair and impartial. He's supposed to be an umpire. The problem with all this, and the problem that everybody at home can see with their own eyes, is that the umpires in this high-stakes game are parading around the field in the majority team's jerseys. The report of evidence released by Republican committee staff on December 2nd carefully documents that in the hearings that led us to this point today, Chairman Schiff directed witnesses called by the Democrats not to answer Republican questions. He rejected witnesses identified Republicans who would have injected some semblance of fairness and objectivity, and he denied Republican subpoenas for testimony and documents, violating the Democrats' own rules to vote down those subpoenas with no notice to Republicans. Chairman Schiff also publicly fabricated evidence about President Trump's July 25th phone call, and he misled the American public about his interactions with the anonymous whistleblower to selectively seek information to paint misleading public narratives. The anonymous whistleblower reportedly acknowledged having a professional relationship with Vice President Biden, and obviously his motives, biases, and credibility are essential to this case, but we can't question it. This is not due process. This is not the rule of law, and this is not how to impeach an American president, and this is not how we're supposed to run a country. It can't be. 17 out of 24 of our colleagues over there already voted to proceed with impeachments before we started all this. They've already made up their minds. They were prejudiced before we walked in, but the American people are not. Fairness still matters, truth matters, and the people can see clearly that this is a sham. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Mr. Goldman, would you welcome the problem of having 8,000 documents given to you from the White House?
It would be a wonderful problem to have.
How many have they given you?
0.
Mr. Castor, you said earlier that they got the aid. They got the aid. No harm, no foul, they got the aid. But you would agree that although Mr. Sandy said that the presidential concern was European contributions, nothing changed from when that concern was expressed to when they actually got the aid, right? You agree on that? Europe didn't kick in a bunch of new money.
Oh, but they did a study. I mean,
a study. Okay, yeah. But they didn't kick in new money. You agree on that?
Ambassador Taylor discussed that they researched.
So you talked a lot about the anti-corruption president that we have in Donald Trump, the person who had a fraud settlement relating to Trump University, the person who just recently, with his own charity, had a settlement related to fraud. Let's talk about that anti-corruption president of ours. Take a wild guess, Mr. Castor. How many times has President Trump met with Vladimir Putin or talked to him?
I don't know the number.
It's 16.
Okay.
How many times has President Trump met at the White House with President Zelensky? It's 0. And who is President Trump meeting with at the White House tomorrow? Do you know?
I'm not.
It's Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov.
Okay.
Now, Mr. Goldman, withholding aid from Ukraine obviously hurts Ukraine. It hurts the United States. Does it help any country?
The witnesses said that would help Russia.
Did you also hear testimony that these acts by the president, while being wrong and an abuse of power, also harmed U.S. national security?
Yes.
Did you hear anything about how it would harm our credibility? And I would turn you to a conversation Ambassador Volker had on September 14 of this year with a senior Ukrainian official, where Ambassador Volker is impressing upon that official that President Zelensky should not investigate his own political opponents. What was thrown back in the face of Ambassador Volker?
After Ambassador Volker suggested to Mr. Yermak, again, who's here, that they should not investigate the prior president of Ukraine, Mr. Yermak said back to him, you're encouraging us to investigate Biden's and Clinton's.
During Watergate, the famous phrase from Senator Howard Baker was asked, "What did the president know and when did he know it?" There's a reason that no one here has repeated those questions during these hearings. We know what the president did, and we know when he knew it. Mr. Goldman, who sent Rudy Giuliani to Ukraine to smear Joe Biden?
President Trump.
Who fired the anti-corruption ambassador in Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch?
President Trump.
Who told Ambassador Sondland and Ambassador Volker to work with Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine?
President Trump.
Who told Vice President Pence to not go to President Zelensky's inauguration?
President Trump.
Who ordered his own chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, to withhold critical military assistance for Ukraine?
President Trump.
Who refused to meet with President Zelensky in the Oval Office?
President Trump.
Who ignored on July 25 his own National Security Council's anti-corruption talking points?
President Trump.
Who asked President Zelensky for a favor?
President Trump.
Who personally asked President Zelensky to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden?
President Trump.
Who stood on the White House lawn and confirmed that he wanted Ukraine to investigate Vice President Biden?
President Trump.
Who stood on that same lawn and said that China should also investigate Vice President Biden?
President Trump.
As to anything that we do not know in this investigation, who has blocked us from knowing it?
President Trump in the White House.
So as it relates to President Trump, is he an incidental player or a central player in this scheme?
President Trump is the central player in this scheme.
There's a reason that no one has said, what did the president know and when did he know it? From the evidence that you have presented, Mr. Goldman, and the Intelligence Committee's findings, we know one thing, and one thing is clear. As it related to this scheme, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, knew everything. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Biggs.
Mr. Castor, what's direct evidence?
When a witness personally observes a fact and testifies to it.
And what's hearsay evidence?
Well, I think the out-of-court statement offered for the truth of the matter asserted is something that you learn in law school.
Right, and under the federal rules of evidence adopted by most states, hearsay is inadmissible unless the testimony falls under a defined exception. Is that right?
That's right. There's about 23, plus the residual exception.
And I believe you were present when every witness testified, including Mr. Sondland, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a yes?
Yes.
And much of the Democrats' report and impeachment narrative is based on the Sondland testimony. Is that a fair characterization?
A lot of it is, yes.
How many times Mr. Sondland mentioned in the Intel Committee's report?
Like I said, I did a search, just a Control F, and the name Sondland shows up 611 times.
Yeah, and just to refresh your mind, Sondland himself told the world that basically nobody else on the planet told him that Donald Trump was trying to tie aid to investigations. In fact, he also said everything that he'd been testifying to is simply his presumptions. Is that right?
That is correct.
And so when we consider what a presumption is, it's not direct, it's not circumstantial, it's not even hearsay. In fact, we typically, when we're trying the case, we consider it as speculation. Is that right?
That's right.
Do courts allow speculation in?
No.
Why not?
Because it's not reliable.
It's inherently unreliable. So, can you name any Democrat witness who asserted that he or she had direct evidence of those 17 that we've been hearing, that we heard from?
We had some direct evidence on certain things. We had some direct evidence on the May 23rd meeting, and Sondland gave some direct evidence, but a lot of what we've obtained has been circumstantial.
How about with regard to personal knowledge of the quid pro quo allegation?
Well, we have not gotten to the bottom of that from a direct evidence standpoint.
How about tying aid to investigations?
That's correct, too.
How about political motives in asking for investigations?
The facts surrounding that are ambiguous.
In the non-legalistic world, when we talk about speculation, we typically use words like gossip, rumor, innuendo. Is that right?
Yep.
And isn't it true that the only direct evidence that we have is that Ukraine received the aid without giving anything in return? President Zelensky has repeatedly stated no pressure, no problem with a phone call in the relationship with Mr. Trump, and that the president had a legitimate concern about Ukraine corruption.
He did, and the burden sharing of European allies.
So much has been made about the alleged desire for an announcement of an investigation. But again, there is no direct evidence that supports the allegation that President Trump wanted merely the announcement of an investigation.
But like I said, there's 8 lines in the call transcript that go to what President Trump said about the investigations. 8 lines.
And everything else is hearsay, innuendo, rumor, gossip, right?
It's inconclusive, certainly.
Yeah. So when we get into this event today in the process, we start talking about the process, were you surprised to see Mr. Burke get out of his chair, move to the seat, and sit down next to the chairman and start asking you questions?
I don't know if I was surprised or not.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I was, and it looks like Mr. Burke has been disappeared. And so that's one of the outrageous things about this process, and it's been outrageous from start to finish. We've seen prejudice and bias against the president from start to finish. We have the lion's share, almost 2/3 of the members of the Democrats have already voted to impeach at least once, and that's before anything with regard to this July 25th telephone conversation ever took place. And we're left with a constant view that as on November 9th, 2016, Representative Green from Texas wanted to begin impeachment proceedings at that point. Is that correct?
Yes.
January 20th, 2017, Washington Post, headline, "Let the impeachment begin." Is that correct?
Yes.
10 days later, Mr. Zaid, who is the attorney for the whistleblower, tweeted out, "Let the impeachment begin, let the coup begin, and victory to the lawyers." Is that right?
Yes, I've seen that.
Yeah. We had people who on this committee came out today and said that they went on TV and said, "We wanted to start impeachment earlier, but the speaker held us back." Did you see that?
I haven't seen that, no.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be news reports today.
Yeah, you wouldn't be surprised about that, though, would you?
No.
No, nobody should be surprised about that, because this is a sham hearing. 3 years that they've been trying to remove this president, and this is the culmination of a predetermined outcome. That's where we are today. And so with that, we bring it back to the same points. No pressure, no conditionality, and all of the aid, meetings, calls were received by the Ukrainians. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Let's just cut through all the Republican arguments today and make things very simple. No one else in America could do what Donald Trump did and get away with it. No American elected official can call up a foreign government official and ask for an investigation of a political opponent. No one sitting on this Judiciary Committee can call up a foreign government official and ask for help in a re-election campaign. If we did that and got caught, we would likely be indicted. Now let's focus on the president's abuse of power in this case, because it's actually worse than the examples I just gave. And I know that I first swore an oath to the Constitution when I joined the United States Air Force on active duty. And the 3 core values I learned were integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. I'd like to focus on the first 2, integrity first and service before self, because it's ingrained in all military members that we cannot mix official duties with personal private gain. So, Mr. Goldman, in this case, the $391 million at issue, that wasn't Donald Trump's money. That was U.S. taxpayer funds. Is that right?
Yes.
And certainly the president should not use our taxpayer money for his own personal benefit, and especially not to leverage it for his own re-election campaign. Isn't that right?
That's correct.
The president's abuse of power is even worse in this case than just using official duties for private gain. It's also just flat out illegal. You cannot solicit foreign assistance for a re-election campaign. That is a violation of Federal Election Campaign Act. Multiple people have gone to prison for violating various sections of that act. A reasonable person could also conclude that the president violated the Impeachment Control Act of 1974, which Congress passed as a response to President Nixon's abuse of power. So I'd like to explore that a little further with you, Mr. Goldman. In this case, Congress, with bipartisan support, had appropriated taxpayer funds for the specific purpose of aiding Ukraine in its war against Russia. Is that right?
Yes.
And not only had that money been appropriated, the money had actually been released to the Department of Defense. Is that right?
They were about to release it, yes.
Okay. And then, suddenly, without explanation, the president demanded that those taxpayer funds be withheld from an ally who desperately needed the aid. Mr. Goldman, did the president notify Congress about his decision to withhold the aid?
No, he did not.
Okay. So the Impeachment Control Act was designed to prevent the president from secretly taking congressionally appropriated funds and doing whatever he wants with them. So is it true that in your intelligence report, you found the following in your findings of fact? President Trump ordered the suspension of $391 million in vital military assistance urgently needed by Ukraine, and the president did so despite his obligations under the Impoundment Control Act. Did you find that?
Yes.
All right. So not only did the president abuse his powers for personal gain, and not only was it illegal, his actions also harmed U.S. national security. So it's a fundamental tenet of U.S. national security to push back against Russian aggression. Ukraine's at the tip of the spear, pushing back against Russian aggression. Is it true, Mr. Goldman, that harming the Ukrainian military also harms U.S. national security?
That's what pretty much every witness said.
Last week, Professor Carlin confirmed that it is an impeachable offense to sacrifice the national interest for his own private ends. A slide shows what she said. Mr. Goldman, based on the evidence that you found in your report, is it fair to conclude that the president's actions both leverage taxpayer funds for his own private gain and sacrifice the national interest for his own private ends?
That is what we found.
I was also personally struck by Mr. Holmes' testimony because it makes it clear that the president did not care about our foreign policy or U.S. national security. He only cared about investigating his political opponent. Here's what Mr. Holmes said.
Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like a war with Russia. And Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing.
Look, here's the thing. If any military member used official acts for personal gain, that member would no longer be part of the military. And in fact, last year, a Navy commander was convicted for taking things of value in exchange for official acts. The U.S. attorney who prosecuted the case said that the commander, quote, put his own selfish interests ahead of the Navy and of our nation, unquote. We should not hold the commander-in-chief to a lower standard than regular military members. We should not hold the president to a different standard than any other elected official. No one is above the law. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, in every election, one side wins and the other loses. Democracy only works because the losing side always respects the will of the voters. The moment that social compact breaks down, democracy collapses into chaos. Now, that's only happened twice in our nation's history. It happened in 1860, when the Democrats refused to accept the legitimate election of Abraham Lincoln, and it happened again in 2016, when the Democrats refused to accept the legitimate election of Donald Trump. The issues before us today do indeed strike at the heart of our democracy. The first calls for impeachment began just days after the 2016 election, and ever since, the Democrats have been searching for a pretext. When the Mueller investigation found no evidence to support the monstrous lie that the president acted in collusion with Russia, the Democrats realized they were running out of time, and suddenly the Ukrainian phone call replaced collusion, Stormy Daniels, tax returns, emoluments, and even tweets as the reason to nullify the election just a year before the next one is to be held. Impeachment is one of the most serious powers with which Congress is entrusted. It requires an overwhelming case of high crime supported by clear evidence that a vast majority of the nation deems compelling. Our Constitution vests the executive authority, including the enforcement of our laws, with the President, and it gives him sole authority to conduct our foreign affairs. Clearly, this includes requesting a foreign government to cooperate in resolving potentially corrupt and illegal interactions between that government's officials and ours. Now, the sum total of the Democrats' case comes down to this. Not one of their hand-picked witnesses provided any first-hand knowledge of the president ordering a quid pro quo, and two witnesses, Sonderland by testimony and Senator Johnson by letter, provided first-hand testimony that the president specifically ordered no quid pro quo. No testimony was provided that the Ukrainian government believed that there was any quid pro quo, but there are ample public statements that its officials did not believe there was such a linkage. In fact, the testimony of their witnesses crumbled under questioning, and we were left with career bureaucrats who admitted that the only evidence they offered was presumption, speculation, and what they'd read in the New York Times. It's upon this flimsy evidence that the Democrats justify nullifying the 2016 presidential election. And it's so flimsy, the Democrats have had to turn our Bill of Rights on its head in order to make it. They've argued that hearsay evidence, better known as gossip, is better than direct testimony. They've argued that the burden of proof rests with the accused to prove his innocence, while at the same time denying the defense witnesses permission to testify. They've argued that the right to confront your accuser is an invasion of the accuser's privacy. They've argued that appealing to the courts to defend your constitutional rights, as the president has done, is ipso facto obstruction of justice and evidence of guilt. They've asserted the power to determine what witnesses the defense is allowed to call. Is an invasion of the accuser's privacy. They've argued that appealing to the courts to defend your constitutional rights, as the president has done, is ipso facto obstruction of justice and evidence of guilt. They've asserted the power to determine what witnesses the defense is allowed to call. Is an invasion of the accuser's privacy. They've argued that appealing to the courts to defend your constitutional rights, as the president has done, is ipso facto obstruction of justice and evidence of guilt. They've asserted the power to determine what witnesses the defense is allowed to call. Is an invasion of the accuser's privacy. They've argued that appealing to the courts to defend your constitutional rights, as the president has done, is ipso facto obstruction of justice and evidence of guilt. They've asserted the power to determine what witnesses the defense is allowed to call.
The national security. The framers set against a potential tyrant's boundless thirst for power the people's representatives here in Congress and the people's own democratic ambitions, our self-respect, our love of freedom and the rule of law, our fierce constitutional patriotism. Now, it looked like President Trump might get away with his Ukraine shakedown. After all, most Americans didn't know anything about it, and the few who learned of it would be too afraid, too intimidated to cross the most powerful man on earth. President Trump could rest easy. But if Donald Trump misjudged the American character, the framers of our Constitution did not. I count 17 honorable public servants who came forward to testify over the intimidation and disparagement of the president. Is that right, Mr. Goldman?
Yes, there were 17.
And I count a dozen career State Department and national security officials who served Republican and Democratic presidents alike over decades who came to testify. In fact, 4 of President Trump's own National Security Council staffers, Hill, Vindman, Morrison, and McGuire, came forward to report Trump's scheme to NSC lawyers as soon as they learned of it, didn't they, Mr. Goldman?
Morrison and Vindman went to the lawyers as soon as they learned of it, yes.
They went to the lawyers, and that moved me a lot because my father was a staffer on the National Security Council under President Kennedy. And he said the most important thing you can bring to work with you every day is your conscience. And he devoted his career to the idea that people must speak truth to power when power becomes a clear and present danger to democracy and to the people. So I want to talk about 2 of the many honorable government witnesses who went under oath and stood up for the truth. Mr. Goldman, who is Dr. Fiona Hill?
Dr. Fiona Hill was the senior director for the Europe and Russia Directorate at the National Security Council until July of this year.
And she was President Trump's senior advisor on Russia.
Correct.
Her family had fled both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia.
I think her family actually came from England. It was Marie Yovanovitch who had...
That was Ambassador Yovanovitch. Yes. Dr. Hill voiced her concerns to the NSC's lawyers on July 10 and July 11th, long before anyone on this committee knew about it. Why did she go to report what she had learned? What motivated her?
She was concerned that Ambassador Sondland and Mick Mulvaney were entering into essentially a transaction whereby the Ukrainians would open up these investigations for President Trump's political interests in return for getting the White House meeting that President Trump had offered.
And I want to talk about Deputy Assistant Secretary George Kent, who served as a career Foreign Service officer for more than 27 years under 5 different presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike. And he wrote or updated notes to file on 4 different occasions to record his grave contemporaneous concerns about the president's conduct. Mr. Goldman, what were the events that led Mr. Kent to draft these notes to his file?
There were several. There was a conversation at the end of June where several American officials had indicated to President Zelensky that he needed to go forward with these investigations. There was one on August 16th, I recall, that he talked about. But you bring up a very important point, which is all of these State Department witnesses in particular, and frankly almost all of the witnesses other than Ambassador Sondland, took unbelievable meticulous notes. I would have dreamed for a witness like that as a prosecutor. And it makes for a very clear and compelling record and clear and compelling evidence that's based on contemporaneous notes.
So do we have Mr. Kent's notes in this process?
We have no State Department records, including these memos to file, the notes, Ambassador Taylor's first-person cable, and emails. There's so many documents that the few that we have gotten have been so helpful to the investigation.
Why do we not have them?
The State Department refused to provide them, notwithstanding our subpoena, under the President's direction.
You know, in authoritarian societies like Putin's Russia or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, people are terrified to speak out about the crimes of their political leaders. But in the United States, a lot of people are not afraid, even though President Trump has tried to intimidate or silence them. And he is trying to make our country more like Russia, and we can be thankful that you found a lot of heroes who stood up for the truth in our Constitution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Lesko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My first 2 questions are for the American people. America, are you sick and tired yet of this impeachment sham? And America, would you like Congress to get back to work and actually get something done? Because I sure would. Mr. Castor, the rest of the questions are for you, and I would like yes or no answers if possible. Mr. Castor, my first question is important. Did any of the Democrats' fact witnesses establish that the president had committed bribery, extortion, or a high crime or misdemeanor?
Good heavens, no.
Mr. Castor, the Deputy Assistant to the President of the National Security, Mr. Morrison, listened in on the phone call. He testified that he was not concerned that anything discussed on the phone call was illegal or improper. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was worried about leaks.
Several Democrat witnesses testified that it is fairly common for foreign aid to be paused for various reasons, including concerns that the country is corrupt and taxpayer dollars may be misspent. Ambassador Volker testified that this hold on security assistance to Ukraine was not significant. Is that correct?
Yes, a number of witnesses also said the same thing.
Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, testified that in Ukraine, and I quote, corruption is not just prevalent, but frankly is the system. Is that correct?
Yes, all the witnesses confirmed the environment is very corrupt.
Mr. Castor, Ukraine energy company Burisma Holdings had a reputation in Ukraine as a corrupt company. Is that correct?
Big time.
According to New York Times, Hunter Biden was part of a broad effort by Burisma to bring in well-connected Democrats during a period when the company was facing investigations. Is that correct?
Yeah, the New Yorker also had a pretty extensive report on that as well.
Obama's Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, George Kent, testified that he raised concerns directly to Vice President Biden's office about Hunter Biden's services on Burisma's board. Is that correct, yes or no?
Yes.
Mr. Castor, in the July 25th call, President Trump referenced Joe Biden bragging about how he stopped the prosecution. We all saw that video earlier today, where Joe Biden bragged about how he told Ukraine, if the prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money. Mr. Castor, is this the same prosecutor that looked into Burisma?
It is.
In a similar scheme, Obama Assistant Attorney General said, and I quote, awarding prestigious employment opportunities to unqualified individuals in order to influence government officials is corruption, plain and simple. Mr. Castor, here is another key question. Given that, 1, Burisma had a reputation of being a corrupt company, 2, Obama's own State Department was concerned about Hunter Biden serving on Burisma's board at the same time that Vice President Biden was acting as the point person to Ukraine, and 3, Obama's Assistant Attorney General said in a similar scheme that there was corruption, plain and simple. Do you think then it is understandable, reasonable, and acceptable for President Trump to ask the Ukrainian president to look into the Hunter Biden Burisma potential corruption scheme?
Yes.
Mr. Castor, there are 4 undisputable facts that will never change that prove there is no impeachable offense. There was no quid pro quo on the July 25th call. Ukraine leadership did not know the aid was held up at the time of the July 25th telephone call. Ukraine received the White House meeting, phone call, and aid, even though 4, Ukraine didn't initiate any investigations. Do you agree?
Ukraine received a meeting with Vice President Pence in Warsaw and a meeting, not at the White House, but at the, in New York at the United Nations.
Mr. Castor, did Mr. Turley testify in the past hearing that this impeachment inquiry has not passed Chairman Nadler's 3-pronged test?
He did.
Thank you. Now I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Goldman, let's focus on the Republican claim that President Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine because he was supposedly concerned about corruption rather than the fact that he abused his office for personal gain. And let me be clear, we actually do not have to read the president's mind on this. As your report notes on page 10, and as we will see on television, he told us himself exactly what his intent was.
What exactly Zelensky would do about the Bidens after your phone call? Exactly. Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer.
So the first and best witness about the president's corrupt intent was Donald Trump. There is also plenty of corroborating evidence, so let's just review some of the basic facts that we've already established. First, President Trump does not even mention the word corruption during either of his calls with President Zelensky, and he disregards all of the talking points that were prepared for him on corruption by the National Security Council. Second, investigations of the Bidens and a debunked conspiracy theory about the 2016 election were not supported by official U.S. policy. And third, Congress authorized military aid to Ukraine. Ukraine passed all the checks that the United States established to ensure that it was taking appropriate actions to fight corruption, and there was unanimous consensus among the State Department, Department of Defense, and National Security Council that the president should release the military aid that Ukraine critically needed to fight Russian aggression. So, Mr. Goldman, between the time that President Trump put a hold on military aid to Ukraine and then released the aid, the president never conducted an actual review or corruption assessment on Ukraine, did he?
That is correct. There was no witness testified that there was any review or any investigation of any sort related to the Ukraine aid.
And isn't it also true that the Defense Department actually determined not to conduct a review on Ukraine after the president froze the military aid because Ukraine had already met all of the corruption benchmarks in May of 2019?
Yes, and everyone involved in Ukraine policy believed that they were on the right path, and President Zelensky in particular.
And in addition to Ukraine having satisfied all the relevant corruption assessments prior to U.S. military aid being withheld, there is significant witness testimony that both the State Department and the Ukrainian embassy actually advised that a White House meeting with President Zelensky would help further an anti-corruption agenda, correct?
Both the anti-corruption agenda and the fighting the aggression from Russia.
And in fact, President Trump's budget actually cut funding for fighting corruption in Ukraine. Now, Mr. Castor argues that President Trump withheld military aid to Ukraine because he was skeptical of foreign assistance in general. But in both 2017 and 2018, didn't President Trump release military aid for Ukraine without any complaints about corruption?
That's correct.
So, Mr. Goldman, the president was perfectly fine giving military aid to Ukraine in 2017 and 2018, but somehow not in 2019. So what changed?
Joe Biden started running for president.
Vice President Biden started running. So the sequence...
And I would add the Mueller report came out, which did not, even though it did not charge the president, it implicated the president and his campaign in welcoming the assistance from Russia and utilizing it.
And the sequence of events and all the corroborating evidence makes it crystal clear that President Trump didn't care about corruption at all. In fact, as he told us himself on national television, he simply cared about his own politically motivated investigations into his political rival. And you saw the clip where Ambassador Sondland picked up the phone, called President Trump, and then Mr. Holmes asked him what the president thought about Ukraine, and quickly, what was Mr. Sondland's answer?
Mr. Sondland said the president does not give a bleep about Ukraine. He only cares about the big stuff, meaning the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. And by the way, just to add, that is a direct evidence conversation between President Trump and Ambassador Sondland on that day, and there are many that we have not talked about on the minority
So
side.
we know what President Trump was interested in based on his words, his actions, and witness testimony. The President of the United States wanted Ukraine to announce an investigation into a political rival for his own personal political benefit, to interfere in our election, and he was willing to use U.S. military aid, which is taxpayer dollars, and an essential White House meeting as his leverage. That is unacceptable and a grave abuse of power. I yield back.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You know, in the Navy, we had a saying, bluff, which is bottom line up front. Let me give everybody the bottom line. We're here because Democrats are terrified that President Trump is going to win re-election. That's really what this all comes down to. Let me get into the specifics. We're here dealing with impeachment because Democrats don't want to talk about the red-hot Trump economy. They don't want to talk about the fact that we have the lowest unemployment rates in 50 years. We're dealing with impeachment because Democrats don't want to talk about how the president has worked to protect American companies from Chinese aggression, how he's renegotiated trade deals to benefit American workers, how he's eliminated burdensome regulations that hurt the economy and that help job creators. Congressional Democrats don't want to be reminded to the American people that the Democrat agenda includes such laughable ideas like banning airplanes, giving illegal immigrants taxpayer-funded health care, and taking private health insurance away from the American people. That's really why we're here. This whole process is just a distraction. It's an attempt to hide the far-left radical agenda. So let's talk about the facts. Schiff's report claims the administration froze military aid for Ukraine without explanation. Yet the facts are that President Trump gave more military aid to Ukraine than President Obama. President Obama gave Ukraine well wishes and blankets. President Trump gave the Ukrainians Javelin missiles. That's the difference, and those are the facts. Let's go over some more facts. House Democrats want to claim it's a conspiracy that Ukrainian officials attempted to interfere with the 2016 election. Yet Ukrainian attempts to interfere with the 2016 election are well documented by Politico, by Financial Times, and The Hill. There was an attempt to influence our elections, and that's troubling, and that's why President Trump brought it to the attention of President Zelensky. Again, those are the facts. But at the end of the day, those facts don't seem to matter to my Democrat colleagues. House Democrats don't care that President Zelensky has repeatedly said there was no pressure. It's not important that the call transcript was the best evidence we have. It is the best evidence we have. It's the actual primary document. And that transcript shows there was no quid pro quo, no bribery. I got to remember we're calling it bribery after an old Latin phrase didn't pull well or test well in a Democrat focus group. My Democrat colleagues seem to really care about focus groups and polling. Unfortunately, again, they don't care about the facts. Because the fact is the Democrats were calling for impeachment before this investigation even began. Representative Tlaib said in January, I don't even think we were sworn in yet. She said in January, impeach the mother. Representative Green said in May, and I quote, I'm concerned that if we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected. These proceedings, this entire process, is nothing more than a political hit job. Well, unlike my Democrat colleagues, I actually do care about the facts, which is why I'm troubled that our committee did not hear from a single fact witness this entire time. We should be here hearing from Hunter Biden. We should be hearing from Schiff's staff. We know that Schiff's staff coordinated with a whistleblower. And again, we need to hear from the whistleblower. Last week, I offered a motion to subpoena the whistleblower to testify in executive session, meaning that he or she could testify behind closed doors. My Democrat colleagues voted my motion down in a partisan fashion. Mr. Castor, can you walk us through the inaccuracies in the whistleblower's complaint?
Well, the first thing about the complaint that troubles us is that it's clearly from an outsider who received information secondhand. The information presented in the complaint is clearly distorted. And it's from a person who it seems to be making a case, like an advocate, about what happened on the call. The whistleblower references a number of individuals inside the White House and at the State Department that he or she has spoken to form the basis of the complaint. We have not been able to piece together all those people, and talking to all those people is important. And there's a lot of, I'm running out of time here, but there's a reference to Lutsenko in the whistleblower complaint where witnesses have told us it's likely Shokin. Vindman and Morrison's testimony about why they went to talk to the lawyers, very different reasons. Mr. Breckbuell.
The gentleman's time is expired.
I don't believe he was on the call. But.
I recognize the gentlewoman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Mr. Goldman, as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I saw significant firsthand evidence that President Trump conditioned our military aid on Ukraine announcing investigations into the 2016 election and the Bidens, and betrayed our national security interests in the process. For example, Ambassador Sondland told us that once the Ukrainians found out about the aid being withheld, it was made, and I quote, abundantly clear to them that if they wanted the aid, and I quote, they were going to have to make these statements. Mr. Goldman, beginning on and around the 25th of July call, through September, would you agree that, consistent with the testimony we just reviewed, Ukraine was made aware that to receive our military aid and the White House visit, that they were going to have to make a statement announcing the investigations?
Not only were they made aware, but they were made aware either by President Trump's proxy, Rudy Giuliani, or from President Trump himself through Ambassador Sondland, who spoke to President Zelensky and Andrei Yermak on September 7th and told them what President Trump had confirmed to him, that the aid was conditioned on the investigations.
And by the end of August, President Zelensky did in fact commit to making that statement on CNN. Is that correct?
That's right. Finally, President Zelensky relented after months of trying to not get involved in what he called the domestic U.S. political process, and ultimately recognizing that he had no choice to break the stalemate, as Ambassador Sondland told them, that he ultimately agreed to go on television before before President Trump got caught and released the aid.
I'd like to direct your attention to the screen in front of you, which displays, again, a Washington Post article from September 5th. The headline says, Trump tries to force Ukraine to meddle in the 2020 elections, and the article reports that President Trump is, and I quote, attempting to force Zelensky to intervene in the 2020 U.S. presidential election by launching an investigation of the leading Democratic candidate, Joe Biden. Mr. Trump is not just soliciting Ukraine's help with his presidential campaign, he is using United States military aid the country desperately needs in an attempt to extort it. So am I correct, Mr. Goldman, that by September 25th, allegations that President Trump was using military aid to pressure Ukraine to announce investigation was being widely reported?
I'm sorry, by what date?
September 5th.
Yes, well, widely reported. There's certainly the aid being withheld was widely reported.
And by September 9th, our investigative committees formally announced a congressional investigation into the president of these issues, into the president about these issues. And Mr. Goldman, what day did President Trump release the military aid?
2 days after the investigations were announced and 2 days after the IG, the Inspector General, told the Intelligence Committee that there was a complaint that was being withheld.
So then am I correct that as the timeline on the screen in front of you shows, it wasn't until after the whistleblower complaint, after the Washington Post report, and after Congress launched the investigations that President Trump finally released the aid?
That's right, and I would just add one thing briefly to the Congressman's point, that it is true that President Trump has given more military assistance than President Obama. And so one would wonder, if he does support military assistance so much, why then is he holding it up for more than 2 months?
And matter of fact, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that people at the NSC, in fact, discussed that Congress's investigation, quote, might have the effect of releasing the hold on Ukraine's military aid because it would be potentially politically challenging to justify the aid. Is that correct, Mr. Goldman?
That was the testimony, yes.
In other words, the aid was released after the president got caught. And what makes me angry is that this president, President Trump, thinks he can get away with it. But he got caught, and he tried to cover it up. But we won't let him do that. And we thank God, Mr. Goldman, for the true, courageous public servants who came forward in spite of intimidation and obstruction from the White House. You see, everybody counts. But everybody is accountable, up to and including the President of the United States. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair. Okay. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Correa. I'm sorry, California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Goldman. My colleagues keep talking about the fact that the president apparently said, and I quote, no quid pro quo on September 7th in a call with Ambassador Sondland. Mr. Goldman, did you receive testimony about this September 7th call?
Yes, we received testimony from 3 witnesses about it, and it gets a little complicated, but that was a consistent refrain through all of the witnesses, is that the president did say no quid pro quo.
Well, let's try to clarify it a little bit. Ambassador Sondland described that call to Mr. Morrison that same day, correct?
That's right.
And Mr. Morrison then reported it to Ambassador Taylor, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And both Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor took notes of those discussions.
They did.
Were those notes produced to the committee?
They were not produced to us, but the witnesses said that they relied on their notes to provide their testimony.
That set of notes was blocked consistent with the president's direction?
Correct.
And in his recitation to Mr. Morrison, Ambassador Sondland said that President Trump himself brought up the words quid pro quo.
That's right. Ambassador Sondland also said that too, yes.
And Mr. Goldman, what did the committee make of this fact?
Well, it was quite odd that the president would volunteer in response to nothing about a quid pro quo, that there was no quid pro quo.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say what's even more important is that what he said immediately after that, which is effectively conduct that amounts to a quid pro quo. He said there's no quid pro quo, but you have to go to the microphone and make this announcement.
Well, let's talk about that. What did the committee make of the fact that, according to Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Morrison, right after President Trump said no quid pro quo, President Trump then told Ambassador Sondland that Ukrainian President Zelensky would have to go to the microphone and announce the investigations of Biden and the 2016 election interference, and that President Zelensky should want to do that himself?
That's right. We had a number of different accounts of this, and I think this is...
They're up on the boards here.
Right, I see that, yes. Ambassador Taylor said that, Mr. Morrison said something similar. Their understandings of that conversation is that there was a clear directive that there was a quid pro quo, factually, from the conduct, from the actions. And we've talked a lot today about the words, and that Zelensky said no pressure, and Trump said no pressure and no quid pro quo. But as an investigator, as a prosecutor, you need to look at the actions to understand what those words mean. And that's why this call in particular is so important.
So let's go further. As we've discussed, multiple individuals reacted with concern to President Trump's call with Ambassador Sondland. Do you recall Mr. Morrison's reaction?
Mr. Morrison said that he was shocked, I think, and that he...
Sinking feeling?
Sinking feeling, correct, and that he went and then talked to the lawyers at the direction of Ambassador Bolton.
Correct. And Mr. Goldman, Ambassador Taylor also testified that he concluded that the military aid was conditioned on Zelensky announcing the investigations, and he testified that this was illogical, crazy, and wrong. Is that right?
That was what Ambassador Taylor testified to, yes.
Now, my colleagues have also pointed out that on September 9th, text message from Sondland reflecting that President has been crystal clear that there is no quid pro quo. Mr. Goldman, am I correct that Ambassador Sondland has now testified that prior to sending his text, he himself came to believe that the aid was conditioned on the announcement of investigations?
Yes, Ambassador Sondland's subsequent public testimony revealed at least 2 things that were precisely false, that were not true in that text message, including that there was no quid pro quo of any kind when he testified, and we saw the video earlier, that there absolutely assuredly was as it related to the White House meeting.
And this September 7th call and the September 9th text occurred after the press reports, that is, after the press reports that President Trump was conditioning military aid on investigations of his political rival. Is that correct?
Yes, and it also, this text occurred after Ambassador Sondland relayed President Trump's message to President Zelensky.
Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committee receive any other evidence relevant to the credibility of the president's assertion that there was no quid pro quo?
We received a lot of evidence, and all of the evidence points to the fact that there was a quid pro quo.
Thank you. I yield.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. Or Madam Chairman.
Can you please hold it until
Madam
after
Chairman.
I do my questions? Thank you.
It'll be very brief. It's just unanimous consent.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Goldman, you talked about actions speaking louder than words, so I want to focus on why it was an abuse of power for President Trump to use the American government to pressure the Ukraine president to benefit his reelection campaign. Let's look at what the president said in his July 25th call to the president of Ukraine. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman listened to the president's call and testified that when President Trump asked Ukraine for a favor, it wasn't a friendly request, it was really a demand. I'm going to direct your attention to this slide about Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's testimony. Why did he say the president's favor was a demand?
He said because the power disparity between the United States as the greatest power in the world and Ukraine, which is so dependent on the United States, not just for the military assistance, but for all of its support, made such a request effectively a demand because President Zelensky could not, in reality, say no.
Am I correct that this vast power disparity exists in part because Ukraine has been at war with Russia since Russia invaded 5 years ago, and over 13,000 of the Ukraine people have died? Is that correct?
Yes, and not only does the U.S. provide 10% of their military budget, but the United States is a critical ally in rallying other countries to support Ukraine. Europe actually gives the European Union gives, I think, 4 times as much money as the United States overall to Ukraine.
So President Trump knew that the Ukrainian president's back was against the wall and President Zelensky needed U.S. validation and support. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, according to the U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, and we have Ambassador Taylor's testimony up there, it wasn't until after Ambassador Sondland told the Ukrainians that there would be a, quote, stalemate, end quote, on the aid, that Zelensky agreed to announce the investigations that President Trump was demanding, correct?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And furthermore, the committee heard testimony that the Ukrainians felt they had, quote, no choice but to comply with President Trump's demands, correct?
That's right, yes, even after the aid was released.
Okay. In fact, when asked in front of President Trump in September whether he felt pressured, President Zelensky said, quote, I'm sorry, but I don't want to be involved to democratic open elections of the USA, end quote. Is that right?
That sounds right if you're reading the quote, yes.
Okay. Now, the president and some of his defenders here have tried to excuse his misconduct by pointing to statements from the Ukraine president that he was not under pressure to give in to President Trump's demand. Did your investigative committees consider those statements by President Zelensky?
We did, and we found that the statements of what is effectively an extortion victim are not particularly relevant to the actual truth of the matter, because President Zelensky cannot, in reality, for the same reasons that he interpreted the request to be a demand, he can't go out and say that he did feel pressure, because that would potentially upset President Trump, and they're so dependent on the relationship with President Trump and the United States.
One could almost say it's similar to a hostage testifying under duress.
It is certainly a duress would be a good word.
So when the president made these statements, and up to and including today, his country was still under attack by Russia, still hadn't gotten a meeting at the White House, and still needed aid from the United States, correct?
That's right, and David Holmes testified very, I think, persuasively about the importance of the White House meeting and of the relationship to Ukraine even after the aid was lifted, including pointing to today when President Putin and President Zelensky met to discuss the war in the East.
So the evidence is clear that President Trump knew he had the power to force Ukraine's hand and took advantage of that desperation and abused the powers of his office by using our taxpayer dollars, basically, to get what he wanted, right?
Yes, and what's really important here, and I think it has to be clarified, is that the evidence showed that the president directly said to Ambassador Sondland that there was a quid pro quo with the security assistance. And there's been some debate and some discussion about that, but that is one thing that the evidence shows based on the Morrison testimony, the Taylor testimony, the Sondland testimony, and the texts. So that's very important to understand that whatever we want to say about hearsay or whatever, that is direct evidence.
And that is precisely the kind of betrayal that our founders sought to prevent. I yield back to myself, and I'll recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Madam Chair, you indicated to me that you would allow me to make my uniform consent after you had asked your question. So I'd ask for uniform consent, or unanimous consent to introduce two letters.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman, who is seeking unanimous consent? What are you seeking unanimous consent?
Mr. Chairman, I have two letters addressed to you, one December 4, 2019, and one December 5th, 2019.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Mr. Chairman, I have a brief parliamentary inquiry regarding scheduling.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, I expressed concern regarding the deeply flawed and partisan process the Democrat majority has been undertaking during this impeachment inquiry. Mr. Chairman, I'm particularly reminded of your quote, "There must never be a narrowly voted impeachment or an impeachment substantially supported by one of our major political parties and largely opposed by the other. Such an impeachment would lack legitimacy, would produce divisiveness and bitterness in our politics for years to come, and will call into question the very legitimacy of our political institutions." You made that statement back in 1998. Now, I'm glad we're moving on to presenting the quote-unquote evidence gathered in this report, not to hear from direct fact witnesses, but a 300-page report that's built largely on hearsay, opinion, and speculation. And I'm especially outraged that the purported author of it, Chairman Schiff, is not here to answer our questions today. Now that we have the report and can discuss the facts within, or the lack thereof, there are 4 facts that will never change. Both President Trump and President Zelensky say there was no pressure. Second, the call transcript shows no conditionality between aid and an investigation. 3, Ukrainians were not aware that aid was withheld when the president spoke. And 4th, Ukraine didn't open an investigation but still received the aid and a meeting with President Trump. I want to move on to the idea of hearsay and the fact that this report contains so much of it and relies on so much of it. Mr. Castor, did the Democrats' impeachment report rely on hearsay to support their assertions?
Yes, it did.
How many times were you able to find assertions based on hearsay?
We went through and counted over 50 instances of key facts.
Can you give us some of the examples of the hearsay being relied on by the majority to make their case?
You know, a lot of the information, for example, that Ambassador Taylor was communicating, you know, he very diligently recorded notes about what some of the various officials told him, but it was about, you know, it was 1 and 2 steps removed from the actual fact. And that's the problem with hearsay, is that it's a whisper down the lane situation. And if some of the people that are doing the whispering have are predisposed to not like President Trump, then what they're whispering down the lane becomes even more distorted.
Did you also find instances where the Democrats' report used witnesses' speculations and presumptions?
And the biggest one, of course, and this has sort of become the big daddy of the hearing, is Sondland presuming that the aid was tied to the investigations, because as he engaged in a back and forth with Mr. Turner, nobody on the planet told him that was the case.
Mr. Castor, I want to move on to foreign policy and the idea that somehow the president was abusing foreign policy. Repeatedly, witnesses came before the Intelligence Committee and talked about how the president was operating outside the bounds of the process for using norms. The president sets foreign policy, correct?
Absolutely.
And from where does he derive that power?
The Constitution.
Article 2, Section 2, in fact.
People, yeah.
Can you give us examples of these members of the foreign policy establishment who took issue with the president's foreign policy direction and choices?
Well, for example, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that when he was listening to the call, he had prepared talking points and the call package, and he was visibly just completely deflated when he realized that his call notes weren't being referenced by the president. And a lot of the interagency officials, I think, became very sad that the president didn't revere their policy making. apparatus.
Is it safe to say there's another reason the president's skeptical of relying on some of these individuals to carry out his foreign policy goals, like rooting out corruption in Ukraine?
I think the president is skeptical of the interagency bureaucracy.
Is that maybe why he instead relied on Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, Ambassador Sondland, and others?
Correct. And by the way, all three of those officials are not that far outside of the chain of the U.S. government.
Would it be appropriate in any investigation of corruption in Ukraine to exempt or remove, say, a political supporter?
Certainly would be.
Would it be inappropriate to remove a political opponent?
That's correct, yeah.
Would it be inappropriate to remove the son of a political opponent from any investigation involving Ukrainian corruption?
Absolutely. I mean, this all goes to the heart of bias.
Thank you for those answers. Mr. Chairman, I go back to what you said this morning about the facts being undisputed. I would argue that the facts, in fact, are disputed. And what you contend are facts are, in fact, not. They are witness presumptions, hearsay, and speculation. And the facts here are, in fact, that this is the shortest impeachment in U.S. history, based on the thinnest of evidentiary records and on the narrowest grounds. Mr. Chairman, this impeachment process is a farce and a stain on the committee and on the House of Representatives, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we just heard, the president and his supporters have claimed that the investigating committees are relying on hearsay and that they have failed to obtain firsthand accounts of the president's conduct. Now, I'm a former judge, and you, Mr. Goldman, a former prosecutor. We know what direct evidence is. Mr. Goldman, my Republican colleagues have suggested there is no direct evidence. Is that true?
No, there's a lot of direct evidence, and a lot of the evidence that they say is hearsay is actually not hearsay.
Indeed, it is not true. Now, I don't want to relive a law school evidence class. Instead, I'd like to go over some examples with you, and please tell me if they are direct or indirect evidence. Ambassador Sondland and Mr. Volker both testified that on May 23, 2019, President Trump told him to, quote, talk to Rudy about Ukraine. Is that direct evidence?
Yes, technically. Well, not technically, but yes.
Thank you. And then we have the memorandum of the July 25th call between President Trump and President Zelensky. Is that direct evidence?
Yes, that is.
So there is direct evidence that President Trump asked President Zelensky to look into these investigations and directed both President Zelensky and U.S. officials to talk to his personal attorney about those investigations, correct?
Yes, and if I could just jump in here on the July 25th call, because these four facts that we keep hearing about that are not in dispute three of them are completely wrong. So one of them happens to be that there's no quid pro quo mentioned in the July 25th call. There is absolutely a quid pro quo when President Zelensky says, I also wanted to thank you for your invitation to visit the United States, specifically Washington, D.C. And then he says, on the other hand, I also want to assure you that we will be very serious about the case and will work on the investigation. That is the quid pro quo that President Zelensky was informed of before the call. So that's wrong. It's also wrong that no Ukrainians knew about the aid being withheld at the time of the call, even though that doesn't even matter. And then finally, there was no White House meeting ever provided. So the third or fourth fact. So I do think that just needs to be clarified, particularly as we're focusing on what direct evidence is.
Well, let's give some more examples. We also heard the testimony of three of the individuals who participated in the July 25 call. Is their testimony direct evidence of what happened during that call?
Yes, although I would say the call record is better evidence than their...
And the day after that call, David Holmes testified that on July 26, he overheard the president ask Ambassador Sondland whether President Zelensky was, quote, going to do the investigation. Is that direct evidence?
That is direct evidence.
And after the July 25 call record was released, the president got on the White House lawn and again declared that Ukraine should investigate a potential political opponent's family, the Bidens. Is that direct evidence?
Yes, it is.
His own words. Now, that seems to me like that's a lot of direct evidence. Mr. Goldman, was there other direct evidence that the committee relied on in addition to these?
Well, there's a lot of evidence that I would call direct evidence because it's not hearsay. If any of the people involved in the scheme are talking to each other and they relay what someone else said, that is not hearsay. That would be in court a co-conspirator statement, and that would be admissible. So let's not get too far afield on talking about direct evidence.
We don't want to relive that
I
evidence
understand,
class.
but it is very important because anything Mr. Giuliani says, anything Ambassador Sondland says, anything any of these people say is not hearsay and would be permitted under the federal rules of evidence. Of course, we don't follow the federal rules of evidence here, which is even more lenient, but that's an important point.
Right. Well, is there anything wrong, Mr. Goldman, with drawing inferences from circumstances?
Courts tell juries to draw inferences every single day in every single courtroom. That is how you determine what the evidence shows. So when Ambassador Sondland draws inferences from the fact that there is no explanation for the aid, the fact that the White House meeting has already been held up because of the investigations, and determines that that's the reason why the security assistance is also held up, that is a natural, logical inference that every jury draws across the country.
Well, I agree with you. I'm just disappointed that rather than to respond to the serious, factual, direct, and undisputed evidence before us, my colleagues continue to make unfounded arguments about the process. What President Trump did here was wrong. It's unconstitutional. And if anyone else did this, they would be held accountable. I urge all my colleagues to face this evidence and uphold the oaths each of us have taken to protect our Constitution. Our democracy depends on ensuring that no one, not even the President, is above the law. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as we approach the 9th hour of this hearing, I want to thank both Mr. Goldman and Mr. Castor for being here today and for your testimony. There's been a lot of discussion about whether or not the facts in this matter are contested. I believe they are not contested. And so I'd like to level set here and give you both an opportunity to address some of the facts that I believe are not in dispute. And I want to begin by addressing something that I think we all know for certain, and that's that Russia interfered in our 2016 election. So, Mr. Goldman, after 2 years of investigation, the special counsel concluded that Russia interfered in our elections in, quote, sweeping and systemic fashion. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Mr. Castor, is that right?
Yes.
And Mr. Goldman, am I correct that 0 intelligence agencies have publicly stated that Ukraine attacked our elections in 2016? Is that right?
That's right. I don't even think that the minority is alleging that the Ukrainian government systematically in any meaningful way interfered. I think this is just based on a couple of news articles.
Mr. Castor, correct?
The president had a good faith belief there were some significant Ukrainian officials.
I hear you, and you've said that previously. I guess I'm asking you.
We haven't said that the Ukrainian government.
And there are no intelligence agencies in the United States that have publicly stated that Ukraine has attacked our elections, right? You're not testifying that that's the case?
I'm not, right, correct.
Right. And in fact, President Trump's former Homeland Security Advisor, Tom Bossert, said that the idea of Ukraine, for example, hacking the DNC server, was, quote, not only a conspiracy theory, it is completely debunked. That's President Trump's Homeland Security Advisor that said those words that you see on the screen to my right. Is that right, Mr. Goldman?
Yes, I saw that interview.
Mr. Castor, you saw that interview?
I'm aware of it, yes.
In fact, isn't it true that none of the witnesses that appeared before your committee testified in support of the theory that Ukraine somehow interfered in our elections? Is that right, Mr. Goldman?
That is absolutely correct.
Mr. Castor?
That's correct, but again...
Thank you. No witnesses testified in support... I'll reclaim my time. No witnesses testified in support of that theory before your committee. Mr. Goldman, isn't it also true that your committee, in fact, received testimony indicating that there is evidence that Russia is, in part, perpetrating this false theory that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 elections because Russia wants to deflect blame for its own involvement?
That is correct. We had evidence of that, and I think that it's very important to emphasize what is evidence and what is pure media reports or speculation, because there is no evidence in our investigation that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election.
And in fact, I'd like to put some of the testimony that I believe you might be referencing, Mr. Goldman, on the screen in front of you, both from Mr. Holmes as well as Dr. Fiona Hill, And I will quote from her testimony, "I am very confident, based on all the analysis that has been done," and again, I don't want to start getting into intelligence matters, "that the Ukraine government did not interfere in our election in 2016. This is a fictional narrative that is being perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves." You recall that testimony, Mr. Goldman?
I do. I also recall her testifying that in addition to the Ukrainian officials who made a couple of disparaging comments about President Trump, there are officials from countries all around the world who also made disparaging comments about President Trump. And as Dr. Hill said, their military assistance was not put on hold.
So given your testimony, and given yours as well, Mr. Castor, it strikes me that there are, in fact, 4 uncontested facts. First, Russia attacked our 2016 elections. Several intelligence agencies have independently confirmed that this is true. Second, Ukraine did not attack our 2016 elections. There's absolutely no evidence that this baseless conspiracy theory. Third, there is evidence that Russia perpetrated the allegation that Ukraine interfered in our 2016 elections. And finally, that Russia benefits from the U.S. investigating Ukraine, which was made clear through public testimony before your committee. So, Mr. Goldman, is it fair to say that the intelligence community agrees with these 4 conclusions?
The intelligence community definitely agrees with 1 and 2. Dr. Hill testified to 3, as well as there's a public statement from Mr. Putin. And yes, certainly the witnesses emphasized 4, that Russia benefits from this. And we saw in my opening statement President Putin's comment that it's good now that Ukraine is all the talk.
And if that is the case, it begs the question, why would President Trump perpetuate this conspiracy theory already disproven by the entirety of the intelligence community that actually helps our adversary, a country that is attacking our elections in real time? With that, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Stubbe.
Mr. Chairman, brief parliamentary inquiry about the schedule.
The gentleman, Mr. Stubbe's already been recognized. He has the time.
So are you going to recognize him for his parliamentary inquiry after my question?
I'll make an announcement about the schedule shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've never seen a more partisan spectacle than what I've witnessed here today. Democrats want the rules to apply when it benefits them and not to apply when Republicans invoke them. 9 hours ago now, Mr. Burke, a hired gun for the Democrats, got 30 minutes to spread his partisan rhetoric and then 45 minutes to cross-examine witnesses. That's 70 minutes more than most of the members of this committee who have been elected by their districts to serve in the United States Congress. And Mr. Burke is an unelected New York lawyer specifically brought in by the Democrats to give his opinion, a politically biased consultant who has given hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal elections to the likes of ActBlue, Hillary Clinton, Obama, and Biden. Mr. Burke gave over $5,000 alone to Hillary Clinton for her presidential race. No wonder why he has an axe to grind. Mr. Burke is a white-collar criminal defense lawyer who brags on his website of getting New York financial brokers deferred prosecution for tax fraud and fund managers off for insider trading charges. And Mr. Burke was able to say whatever he wanted to say without swearing an oath to his testimony that it would be truthful. So he can sit before this committee, not as a fact witness, and directly lie to the American people without any threat of criminal prosecution. Makes sense. He's a white-collar criminal defense lawyer. I'm sure he didn't want to incriminate himself. This is the same Mr. Burke who authored a series of reports as early as October 2017, 2 years ago, on his opinion as to whether President Trump obstructed justice and colluded with Russia. He also represented Mayor Bill de Blasio in a federal investigation of de Blasio's fundraising activities. For my fellow Americans and Floridians watching this charade, this is who was sitting at the top of the dais next to the chairman acting like a member of this committee, a partisan New York lawyer with a written bias against President Trump who gave thousands to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. And all of this spectacle, all of it, not a single fact witness has appeared in front of this committee. We have been denied a minority hearing day, which I asked for the last hearing. All we have had testify are partisan lawyers giving their opinions. So let's talk about the facts that we do have before us. We heard from Mueller. No evidence that the Trump campaign colluded or conspired with Russia to influence the 2016 election. No obstruction of justice. After denying the president to call witnesses in closed-door secret proceedings and denying Republicans from calling all their witnesses in closed-door proceedings, denying the president's counsel to cross-examine witnesses in intel hearings, the facts are this. Sondland stated when questioned, "Did the president tell you about any preconditions for anything?" His answer, no. For the aid to be refused? No. for a White House meeting? No. Ambassador Sondland also testified that President Trump wanted nothing from Ukraine. Tim Morrison, when questioned, and there was no quid pro quo, answered, correct. The aid was released. 4 facts never change. Both President Trump and President Zelensky say there was no pressure. The call transcript shows no conditionality between aid and an investigation, no quid pro quo. Ukrainians were not aware that aid was withheld when the president spoke. Ukraine didn't open an investigation, but still received aid in a meeting with President Trump. Mr. Castro, has any committee heard from the whistleblower, either in closed-door hearings or in open hearings?
No.
Did Chairman Schiff state that he would call the whistleblower to testify?
He did.
Has that happened?
It has not.
Is it going to occur?
I hope so.
Have other countries' aid also been held up?
Yes.
Mr. Goldman, on October 2nd, the New York Times reported that the whistleblower, quote, approached a House Intelligence Committee aide with his concerns about Mr. Trump. Is that accurate?
Sorry, say that again?
On October 2nd, the New York Times reported that the whistleblower approached a House Intelligence Committee aide with his concern about Mr. Trump. Is that accurate?
I think the whistleblower's concerns about President Trump are from the threats, the
No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm
getting
asking,
from
did
him, which is
the
why he hasn't been
whistleblower
involved.
approach a House Intelligence Committee? Let me ask it a different way. Have you had any communications with the whistleblower?
As I said earlier in response to questions from your colleagues, I'm not going to get into any.
So you're refusing to answer whether you've communicated with the whistleblower?
The whistleblower is not relevant to this report.
He's the whole basis of the beginning of this investigation. He's absolutely relevant to this committee
he's
and
not
to the
relied
American
upon.
people.
The whistleblower's complaints, for the reasons that Mr. Castor said, are not included. His allegations are not included in our report because the evidence has been outstripped and surpassed by the 17 witnesses that we have had come in to testify directly about the conduct that the whistleblower blew the
So as
whistle
you sit
about.
here today, do you know the identity of the whistleblower?
Sir, I'm not going to talk to you about the identity of the whistleblower.
Because you're also refusing to answer whether
No,
you've had
this was what the
communications.
intelligence-
That's my time, not yours. You're refusing to answer whether you had communications with the whistleblower. Has any other staff in the Intel Committee had communications with the whistleblower?
Sir, in the Intelligence
And you're
Committee,
refusing to answer that question.
in
And
the
unfortunately, the
Intelligence
American people want to know those answers, and unfortunately, my time is expired.
Congress has a right to
Mr. Chairman.
retain the
Time of the-
anonymity
Mr. Chairman.
of the
Point of
order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous
Time of-
consent. I have unanimous consent.
The gentleman will suspend. The time of the gentleman, the time of the gentleman has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I have unanimous consent.
The gentleman will state his unanimous consent request.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I ask for admission of the document entitled Ukrainian Efforts to Sabotage Trump Backfire, dated January 11th, 2017.
We'll, if you give it to our staff, we'll take a look at it and we'll make,
Should I make a
that
motion to
shortly.
insert instead, Mr. Chairman?
I want to, before I recognize Ms. McBath, I want to announce that with respect to scheduling, that this hearing will proceed until the votes are called. It may end before votes are called, which would be nice. If it does not end before votes are called, then we will recess for the votes and we'll reconvene here as soon as the votes on the floor are over. It's going to be a close call. We'll see. I will further announce that I'm not prepared to say anything further about the schedule of the committee beyond today's hearing.
Point of order, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Mr.
Chairman, point of order.
Who seeks recognition for a point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
Who's I?
To your right, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Deutsch seek recognition?
To ask, I wanted to confirm, a point of order is there are rules of decorum, and I don't believe that the gentleman from Florida meant to violate them, and I want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but more than once he referred to a New York lawyer, and if he could just explain what he meant, then I'm prepared to withdraw my point of order.
It's not a point of, that's not a cognizable point of order.
Mr. Chairman, point of order regarding the schedule.
Point of order regarding the schedule? There's no
Yes.
point of order regarding
Well,
the
on
schedule.
this case, there is, because
There's no
rules-
point of order
rules have been
regarding the
violated.
schedule.
Then
There's no
parliamentary inquiry. Will you
cogni-
answer my question? It's a
The
simple-
gentleman will suspend. There is no cognizable point of order regarding the future schedule.
Okay, a
Ms.
parliamentary
Ms.
inquiry,
McBath.
will you recognize that?
No, Ms. McBath is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman, I want to follow up on just one part of President Trump's conduct that, excuse me, I asked our constitutional scholars about last week. The investigative committees found evidence that President Trump intimidated, threatened, and tampered with prospective and actual witnesses in the impeachment inquiry, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Goldman, it is a federal crime to intimidate or to seek to intimidate any witness appearing before Congress. Is that right?
Yes, there's a little bit more to it, but that's the gist of it, yes.
Mr. Goldman, am I correct that President Trump publicly attacked witnesses before, after, and even during their testimony?
That is correct.
I'd like to quickly go through some examples. On Twitter, the president tried to smear Ambassador Bill Taylor, a former military officer who graduated at the top of his class at West Point, served as an infantry commander in Vietnam, and earned a Bronze Star and an Air Medal with a V device for valor. He was attacked for doing his duty to tell the truth to the American people, correct?
He did his duty by testifying, yes.
President Trump also attacked other Trump administration officials who testified before the Intelligence Committee, including Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman, who is the director for Ukraine on the National Security Council, and Jennifer Williams, the special advisor on Europe and Russia with the Office of the Vice President. Am I right?
That is right, yes.
Mr. Goldman, I think another troubling example of this is the president's treatment of Ambassador Yovanovitch. When you questioned Ambassador Yovanovitch, you asked her about the president's remark that she would, and I quote, go through some things. She told you that that remark sounded like a threat. Is that right?
Yes, in the July 25th call, that's when President Trump said that.
Ambassador Yovanovitch is a career professional who served in Republican and Democratic administrations. She was once caught in live crossfire during a coup attempt. And here's how she described that experience in her very own words.
I later served in Moscow. In 1993, during the attempted coup in Russia, I was caught in crossfire between presidential and parliamentary forces. It took us 3 tries, me without a helmet or body armor, to get into a vehicle to go to the embassy. We went because the ambassador asked us to come. And we went because it was our duty.
It was our duty. Even under such duress, this is a public servant who did her duty. And as she testified before you and the Intelligence Committee, the president tweeted yet another attack against her. Is that correct?
During the testimony, yes.
At a rally, the president further attacked Ambassador Taylor and Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State, George Kent, Foreign Affairs official with decades of bipartisan service. I just have to say, I am so deeply saddened that our president has attacked our brave public servants. These attacks are an abuse of his power, and they betray our national interest. My Republican colleagues until now have agreed with me that this behavior is not okay. That in America we protect witnesses and people who tell the truth. We want people to come forward. We protect witnesses in our community. I myself am no stranger to these kinds of attacks. They are not okay. I want to read a partial statement by Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who is a military officer and a public servant. In his opening statement to the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Vindman said, and I quote, I want to say that the character attacks on these distinguished and honorable public servants is reprehensible. I ran for Congress because I care urgently about health care, gun violence prevention, and our veterans. Those are the urgent policies for me and many of my colleagues. But these witnesses, these public servants, stood up and courageously told the truth. And I must be courageous and stand up for them as well. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. A few minutes ago, Mr. Biggs asked unanimous consent to admit an article from Politico into the record without objection. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard today from some suggesting that this process has somehow been unfair. Mr. Goldman, let's clear up that record. Minority members on the investigative committees had access to all witness depositions. Is that correct?
Yes, and all the documents.
And were they allowed to ask questions of every witness?
The minority was given equal time to the majority for every single interview, deposition, or hearing that we did.
And the minority were allowed to call their own witnesses to the live hearings. Is that correct?
They were also, yes, and they did, and they got 3 witnesses. They were also allowed to call their own witnesses for the depositions. They chose not to do that. The only witness they requested for the deposition was Chairman Schiff, who is not a fact witness to this investigation.
Mr. Goldman, why did the investigative committees decide to conduct initial depositions behind closed doors?
The best investigative practice when you're doing a fact-finding mission is to keep the information closed. And the reason is exactly what I described earlier with Ambassador Sondland, who, first of all, the day before his deposition, he spoke with Secretary Perry about his testimony. That is the type of tailoring that can happen when people are engaged in misconduct and they try to line up their stories. So if you keep the information closed, they can't line up their stories. And I think, frankly, part of the reason why Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Sondland's public hearing testimony was so different from their deposition testimony is because the initial depositions were in closed session before we then released all the transcripts to the public.
And this isn't unprecedented because in both the Nixon and Clinton impeachment inquiries, there were either closed-door depositions or grand jury proceedings at the beginning of the inquiries.
That's correct, nor is it unprecedented in Congress. This is actually a rule in the House rules that was passed by Republican Congresses. It was used in Benghazi. It was used by a number of committees for the past decade or so.
And for clarity, President Trump has received all procedural protections afforded to other presidents facing impeachment. Is that correct?
That is right. In the Judiciary Committee, he's had all of the options. Our inquiry was not the Judiciary Committee's investigation. That is where the president's ability to present evidence. Of course, if the president wanted to present evidence in the Intelligence Committee, he could have provided documents, he could have provided the witnesses that we asked for him, but he obstructed rather than cooperated.
And the president has been invited to participate in the House's impeachment inquiry, correct?
Yes.
But the president declined the invitation?
That's my understanding, yes.
Twice?
Twice thus far, yes.
In fact, the president not only refused to participate, but he has also tried to stop Congress from obtaining evidence. Isn't it true that the president has refused to produce any documents in response to the impeachment inquiry's subpoena to the White House?
Yes.
Not a single one.
Not a single document.
The president also directed all of his agencies to refuse to produce documents. Is that right?
That is also true.
Based on the president's order, federal agencies have ignored more than 70 specific requests or demands for records from the investigative committees. Is that correct?
Yes, and if I could just add, this would ordinarily be a document case. If you were prosecuting this case, you'd be basing it on the documents. So the fact that those documents are being withheld is quite significant, and it's quite remarkable that we built the record we have on the witnesses.
The president's order to obstruct Congress didn't just extend to documents. At the president's direction, witnesses also refused to testify. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in total, more than a dozen members of the administration defied lawful subpoenas or requests for testimony or documents, as we see on the slide.
Right, between testimony and documents, that's correct.
And isn't it also true that when witnesses chose to follow the laws and testify, the president denied those witnesses access to the documents they needed to properly prepare for their testimony?
For some of them, that's correct.
But I also must acknowledge that this process has been challenging and in many respects less than fair. I have not had access to all of my phone records, State Department emails, and many, many other State Department documents. And I was told I could not work with my EU staff to pull together the relevant files and information. These documents are not classified, and in fairness, should have been made available.
The State Department has collected all materials in response to the September 27th subpoena that may contain facts relevant to my testimony. I have no such documents or materials with me today.
The president was not denied the right to participate, quite the opposite. The president has chosen not to participate, and he has consistently tried to obstruct the impeachment investigation to ensure no one testifies against him, that no one produces a document that may incriminate him, and to engage in a cover-up to prevent the American people from learning the truth. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, may I just say
Gentleman
something
yields
for
back.
5 seconds? Mr. Chairman, please.
Gentlemen, for what purpose is the gentleman seeking?
No, this is the witness. Can I just say something for 5 seconds?
No. The gentlelady, Ms. Dean is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldman, some have argued that we should wait, that we're moving too fast, that we should try to get more evidence. Let's examine why these arguments are without merit. President Nixon stated during the Senate Watergate investigation, quote, "All members of the White House staff will appear voluntarily when requested by the committee. They will testify under oath, and they will answer fully all proper questions," end quote. During the investigation of President Clinton, Ken Starr interviewed White House staff. President Clinton also provided written responses to 81 interrogatories from the House Judiciary Committee. Unlike his predecessors, President Trump has categorically stonewalled Congress's investigation at every turn. Indeed, as far back as April, the president expressed his intent to stonewall.
Well, we're fighting all the subpoenas.
More recently, on October the 8th, White House counsel Pat Cipollone echoed this sentiment in a letter reflecting the president's instruction that all executive branch officials not testify in this impeachment inquiry. Are you aware of that letter, Mr. Goldman?
Yes, I am.
And Mr. Goldman, is it fair to say that President Trump is the only president in the history of our country to seek to completely obstruct an impeachment inquiry undertaken by this House?
That is correct. It is unprecedented.
And in fact, pursuant to President Trump's order, 12 executive branch officials refused to testify as part of the House impeachment inquiry, 10 of whom defied congressional subpoenas. Am I right?
Yes.
Given the president's sweeping directive not to cooperate with Congress, did the investigative committees believe that there was any chance that other administration officials would come forward if subpoenaed?
No, it became clear that the president was trying to block everything and block everyone, and eventually they came up with an alternative reason to write an opinion to prevent people from coming, which is quite an aggressive view that they took. But it was quite clear that they were trying to block every single witness.
Some have said that the investigative committee should have gone to court. Did you decide not to go to court?
We thought about it a lot because obviously there are additional witnesses and we want this to be as thorough an investigation. But as you can see from the Deutsche Bank case or the McGahn case, it takes months and months to go through the appeals court. And that's effectively what the president wants, is just to delay this as long as possible and to the next election.
Let's take a look at that exact case, the McGahn case, because we're all intimately aware of it. On April 22nd, this Judiciary Committee served a subpoena for testimony to White House counsel Don McGahn. And after McGahn refused to testify on May 21st, the committee filed a lawsuit on August the 7th to compel his testimony. And even though we did request expedited ruling, it was another 3.5 months before Judge Jackson found the Constitution does not allow a president to kneecap congressional investigations because, as the judge wrote, and I put up on this screen, quote, "Presidents are not kings." As you know, McGahn has appealed, and a hearing is set for January the 3rd now of next year. As we sit here today, 8 months since we issued that subpoena, would you agree it's likely we will not have an appeals court ruling for many months to come?
It's quite possible that it could be several more months, and then there may be the Supreme Court.
Exactly. McGahn may appeal to the Supreme Court, and conceivably that could take another many months, year, more.
Depends on whether it's this term or it gets pushed over to the next term, but yes.
And given this delay, illustrated by the McGahn example specifically, would you agree that if we go to court to enforce the investigative committee subpoenas, we could face another months or years-long delay to hear testimony?
Absolutely, and there's an ongoing threat because the president is trying to cheat to win the next election. It's not something that happened in the past, it's continuing in the future. So we cannot delay and just wait for the courts to resolve this, when the reason why we would have to go to the courts is because the president is obstructing an investigation into himself.
And the urgency is not just about our elections, but also our national security, am I right?
That is a critical component to it.
Let me end with this. What is plain is that we cannot wait. What is plain is that wait means never. We must not let this president disregard, defy, and delay justice. This president has shown that he repeatedly abuses the power entrusted to him by the people. Every moment we wait is another opportunity to chip away at the foundation of our Constitution, so carefully crafted by our founders. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I yield to Ms. Jackson-Lee for the unanimous consent request.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Goldman, Mr. Castor. I'd like to submit or ask unanimous consent to insert in the record, referred in my questioning, Statement of Administration Policy, Department of Defense Appropriations.
Without objection.
August 5th.
Without objection, Ms. McCarcel.
And the call dated July 25th.
Without objection, Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Castor, it's been a long day, been a long couple months. You've been in the middle of this, and I know previously you wanted to say something, so.
Thank you. I've resisted my willingness to be athletic here in the afternoon. But I want to say a few things. First of all, the Republicans on the Intelligence Committee submitted a number of subpoenas, and we never got a vote. There was a motion to table. It disposed of them. Ranking Member Nunes sent a letter on November 8th asking for witnesses. Ranking Member Collins sent a letter on December 6th asking for witnesses. Some of these witnesses would have touched at the heart of the issue that our members are concerned about, and that is, were Ukrainians trying to interfere with our elections? I mean, this is a fact that is meritorious of investigation. The Ukrainians ought to investigate it, and to the extent it happened here in the U.S., we ought to be investigating it. And so, to the extent that hasn't happened, Republicans have attempted to do that during this process. So, I'd like to say that. And I have a couple other things, Mr. Armstrong, if I may. Ambassador Sondland is relied on, and he went from a witness that was not very favorable to very favorable at his hearing. And one of the remarkable statements at his hearing was that everyone was in the loop. And he types up this email to Pompeo, to the secretary, and the emails that he used to demonstrate that everyone was in the loop are not conclusive at all. He talks about this statement that was going back and forth during the early part of August. First of all, Volker said all along that he didn't think the statement was a good idea. Volker and Yarmak toyed around with the statement, and ultimately, both sides decided that it wasn't a good plan. So they didn't do it. And so the fact that Sondland is emailing the secretary talking about this statement and so forth, this doesn't show that everyone's in the loop. Ambassador Hale testified to us that people at the State Department, they don't just email the secretary. I mean, the secretary gets email, of course, but it's not like this. There's a whole secretariat that filters his email, and so it's not, emailing the Secretary of State is not quite as simple as I think Ambassador Sondland made it seem here. And so I just wanted to address that. We talked a couple times about the reliability of George Kent's notes. One of Ambassador Volker's assistants, Catherine Croft, testified, and it was a rather startling piece of testimony. She was asked whether Kent's notes would be reliable. Sort of a typical question, and everyone expecting the answer to be yes, except she said, no, I don't think Kent's notes would be reliable. So I think that's important to put on the record that, that there is evidence that, perhaps Mr. Kent, felt some emotions about some of these issues, and his notes, at least according to one State Department official, might not in fact be reliable. The CNN interview that there's been discussion about. Okay, there was discussion about possibly doing a statement which was canned. There was, maybe there was discussion of a CNN interview, but that's fine. We did not really get to the bottom of that. That was sort of this amorphous fact that was out there. Ambassador Taylor testified that he was worried it would happen, but we didn't really talk to anyone that could tell us precisely what was going to occur, in the CNN interview and whether President Zelensky was actually going to do it. If you look back at the statement that Yarmak and Volker were talking about, Yarmak wasn't comfortable doing it. And so when it comes to the CNN interview, it's possible that Yarmak would have advised President Zelensky not to say what people thought he was going to say. So anyway, I'm sorry, Mr. Armstrong, for taking
No, you've worked hard and you deserve it. I just want to end and summarize with this, that you can, because you cannot prove a crime, and Chairman went on TV yesterday and said they get a conviction in 3 minutes, but my question is, for what crime? The Mueller conspiracy fell flat. The obstruction charge was abandoned when the public hearing was over. Campaign finance is a non-starter. The victim of conspiracy, or the victim of bribery and extortion, says he's not a victim. Because you can't prove any of it does not mean you can use all of it, and that's no way to prosecute a case, and it is no way to proceed with impeachment. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell is recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. McCarcel-Powell is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Goldman, I want to come back and highlight what I think is the biggest national security threat, and that's foreign interference into our elections. And I can tell you that in Florida, we're extremely concerned about the security of our elections and the potential for election interference by foreign governments, especially Russia, because Florida, my home state, was a victim of Russian hacking in 2016. And there's every indication that they're trying to do the same thing right now. Our country was founded on the premise that our elected officials are elected by the people. But President Trump doesn't share these ideas. He has and continues to demand foreign interference into our elections. He doesn't want the American people to decide. He's inviting foreign interference, allowing foreign governments to decide that for us. Mr. Goldman, it's been confirmed that President Trump's campaign actively sought Russia's interference in our 2016 elections, correct?
What Special Counsel Mueller said is that President Trump did invite them and solicit them to hack Hillary Clinton's emails. Ultimately, the Trump campaign, I think it was welcomed, knew about the interference, welcomed it, and utilized it.
Right, and in 2016, Trump said, Russia, if you're listening, and within 5 hours, Russian intelligence targeted the emails of Trump's opponent. On October 3rd, 2019, when asked what he hoped President Zelensky would do about the Bidens, this is what President Trump said.
Well, I would think that if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer. They should investigate the Bidens, because how does a company that's newly formed, and all these companies, if you look at, and by the way, likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens.
And let me just point out, the president doesn't mention corruption, does he, Mr. Goldman?
No, he doesn't. As I said, it became quite clear in all of his comments and all of the other witnesses that any mention of corruption or anti-corruption was really meant, and the evidence showed this, was really a euphemism for the investigations.
Correct. And Trump is not only asking, President Trump, excuse me, is not only asking Ukraine, but he also says China should start investigating his political opponents. The president's pattern of behavior is incredibly disturbing. Russia, Ukraine, China, he's inviting 3 countries to help him in his re-election campaign. And Mr. Goldman, I don't see any reason to believe he wouldn't ask any other governments, for example, Venezuela, correct?
He could, I mean, at this point, he has shown not only a willingness to do it multiple times, but I think more importantly for all of the members' consideration, he's also shown a lack of contrition, a lack of acknowledgement that what he is doing is wrong and that it is wrong. And if you don't recognize that it is wrong, then there is no reason why you won't do it again if you've already done it.
Exactly. I mean, we saw Giuliani in Ukraine just 3 days ago. And last night, I want to point out that the Washington Post actually released an article saying that Rudy Giuliani has been now advising on how to open a back channel between President Trump and Maduro. So I'm very worried about that. Now, I don't think we have any time to wait to see if any countries are now going to take him up on the offer to help him in his re-election campaign. Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committees reach any conclusions about the ongoing threats, the continuing risk that the president poses?
Yes, for the same reasons that we just discussed. I mean, and I think the June of television interview with George Stephanopoulos this year, where the president indicated that he would once again welcome foreign interference, is another data point to understand where it is. And I would just say to Mr. Reschenthaler, who was saying that he's got such a great record and that the Democrats just don't want him to win. The question is, if that is the case, and that very well may be the case, then why does he need to cheat to win the election? Why can't he just go on his own platform?
I think the Constitution demands that the president follow the rule of law and fight to keep our elections fair, free of corruption, and free of Russian interference, foreign interference. Now, I know that I was elected by the people of Florida, and I work only for the people of this country. I'm not going to let, while I'm in office, anyone interfere in our elections or threaten our democracy. The continuing pattern of behavior we've seen from this president should be a warning to the American people that it is a beginning of a dictatorship, which I have seen in Latin America. I've witnessed men in office abuse the power, inviting foreign interference, and also obstructing any checks on their power. The Constitution has no partisan allegiance. We cannot allow this behavior from this president or any future president. Our democracy depends on it.
The gentlelady yields back. I recognize Mr. Jordan for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
I recognize Mr. Jordan for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The majority's witness was wrong when he said that we were able to subpoena people and get our witnesses here.
Unanimous consent request.
We were not. So I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the two letters sent to Chairman Nadler and the other one to
Without objection, the material will be entered into the record. Ms. Escobar is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and many thanks to our witnesses who've spent the entire day with us. We're very grateful. Despite what our Republican colleagues have stated over and over again, their own witness, Mr. Castor, has agreed that these investigations have indeed produced direct evidence which any objective observer, in my opinion, would regard as overwhelming. That evidence proves that the president solicited foreign interference in the 2020 election, pressured Ukrainian President Zelensky to publicly announce unfounded investigations, conditioned a White House meeting, the president conditioned a White House meeting and $391 million on the announcement of the investigations, and then the president covered up his conduct and obstructed the investigation. Those findings reflect a serious abuse of power by the president. Yet we are being asked to ignore what we've seen with our own eyes and what we've heard with our own ears. So, Mr. Goldman, I'd like your help in responding to some of the claims that my Republican colleagues have made today.
Happily.
The president and his allies say that there was no quid pro quo. In other words, they claim that the president wasn't withholding the aid in exchange for the manufactured political investigation. Isn't it true that the aid was withheld and that there has been no logical explanation for the withholding of that aid?
There's common sense that leads one to conclude that the aid was withheld for the investigations. And then there's also direct evidence in that the president's own words to Ambassador Sondland on September 7th said the same thing.
Thank you. President Trump knew he had leverage over President Zelensky, and in fact, David Holmes testified that Ambassador Sondland told President Trump that President Zelensky will, quote, do anything you ask him. Is that correct?
That is what Ambassador Sondland said. Yeah, or actually, that's what Ambassador Sondland said to President Trump. Apologies.
You testified earlier that evidence shows that the Ukrainians, in fact, did know that the aid was being withheld. My colleagues continue to say, and their witness continue to say, that there couldn't be leverage because they had no idea that the aid was being withheld. Yet there has been evidence that shows that they knew. Is that correct?
Well, I think it's important just for a second here to take a step back. It doesn't matter when they knew, as long as they knew at some point. Then they realized at that point that the investigations were dependent on the aid. But in addition, there is a lot of evidence that they knew before it became public on August 28th.
And you're right, it doesn't matter. If you're about to be held up at gunpoint by a burglar, it doesn't matter whether you know or not. The intent is still there by the criminal about to commit the act. My Republican colleagues also make much about the fact that the aid was finally released. But isn't it true that it wasn't released until the president got caught?
It wasn't released until the president got caught, and all of the money didn't actually get to Ukraine in that fiscal year, and you all in Congress had to pass another law to allow for the money to get to Ukraine.
Thank you. Earlier today, Mr. Castor attempted to explain away the president's request for foreign interference in our election by claiming that the president had 3 concerns. That number 1, the president was concerned about Ukraine corruption. That number 2, he was concerned about burden sharing with Europe. And number 3, he brought up the debunked conspiracy theory about Ukraine election interference, which, by the way, that last point we know is a Russian talking point. Mr. Goldman, did the investigative committees consider those 3 explanations? And if so, what did the evidence show about whether President Trump's request was actually motivated by those concerns?
It's a very good question. There are 2 things that were discussed here today. One is evidence, and one is assertions and opinions. Based on the evidence, there is no evidence to support any of those 3 things that you just mentioned. There's no evidence to think that the president acted towards Ukraine because of his concerns about corruption, even if he held those concerns. That was not the motivating factor. There's no evidence that his concern about other European countries giving enough money motivated him, and there is certainly not a reasonable belief, given all of the evidence, that he believed that Ukraine interfered in our 2016 elections.
Thank you. I'd like to close with what our scholars explained to us last week about why all of this is so important.
Drawing a foreign government into our elections is an especially serious abuse of power because it undermines democracy itself.
Because if we cannot impeach a president who abuses his office for personal advantage, we no longer live in a democracy. We live in a monarchy, or we live under a dictatorship.
If what we're talking about is not impeachable, then nothing is impeachable.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Can I respond to that?
This concludes the 5-minute round of questioning. I now recognize Mr. Raskin for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I'm seeking unanimous consent to introduce a statement by the late Chairman Elijah Cummings of the Oversight Committee in his first hearing in the new Congress, which was on examining prescription drug prices. His first hearing was not about Michael Cohen, as was asserted earlier.
Without objection, I now recognize the ranking member for any concluding remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One quick thing before we enter. It does matter when they knew and didn't know, because after they supposedly found out, it does matter because after 2 meetings with officials from the United States, it was never talked about and no linkage was made. So it does matter. And the reason it matters is because if there is no understanding that this is being withheld, there is no threat, there is no quid pro quo. And it also goes to the state of mind of Mr. Zelensky, who says, I'm not being pressured, there's nothing here. And again, it goes back to the amazing thought of this majority who keeps calling the Ukrainian leader a liar. It's just amazing that we continue to propagate that myth here tonight. But what did we learn today? Here's some things we did learn today. It's an unprecedented hearing that Mr. Sensenbrenner and others talked about, in which staff basically not members, gave testimony and questioned each other and got into very heated debates with each other. This is not what the Judiciary Committee should be doing. It's not the way this should be held. Again, the reason it is, Mr. Goldman handled himself very well, but he's not Adam Schiff. He doesn't wear a member pin. This is ridiculous. We shouldn't be doing this. The Intel Committee also, what we did find out today, took phone records and went on a political endeavor against the ranking member and others, but no one will take responsibility for telling the staff to use Mr. Nunez's numbers or others, or who decided to put the smear job in the report. We'll just assume that's Mr. Schiff, since I do hold the member accountable. You know, also we found out today, which is really interesting, that staff can determine what's relevant or not members of Congress. It's interesting to me that staff told members of Congress that that wasn't relative or that wasn't relevant. Again, it goes back to the problem that we don't have members here to actually talk about this. Also, it just is another thing we've learned today that the chairman continues to just disregard House rules. Just completely, blatantly disregarding House rules on not addressing the minority hearing day. And if I hear basically one more time, I'll address that when we're marking up impeachment articles. What is the use of a minority hearing day if you're going to have evidence about the markup if you get the confirmation at the markup itself? Even your most heated debate on getting rid of this president does not show any way that can be fair. And in the end, both parties are in the minority. If you destroy the institutional integrity, which again, the staff have talked about today, if we destroy the institutional integrity, there's nothing else for us to do. But while we were here, there was something that did happen. And as we were sitting here discussing whether to impeach the president over a call he had with the Ukrainian president and President Zelensky, which took place on how there was a look at how it happened in 2016. Democrats are seeking to impeach the president over that, and we're seeing the problems with the Russia investigation play out again in front of our eyes. The fuss over the Ukraine is the same thing, using the same playbook. A select group of individuals colluding against the President Trump to ensure they get him. And they are blowing through every procedure and principle of fairness and honesty to ensure they get him in time. So what happened today while we were stuck here? The Inspector General report. The review of 4 FISA applications and other aspects of the FBI Crossfire hurricane investigation. Here's some of the top findings. The FBI included inaccurate information in the Carter Page FISA application. The FBI failed to include exculpatory information in the FISA. The FBI did not corroborate a huge amount of the information in the Page FISA. The FBI chose to defensively brief candidate Clinton, not candidate Trump. The FBI failed to disclose Bruce Orr's information that Steele reporting was going directly to the Clinton campaign. An FBI attorney altered another agency's email to mislead about whether Carter Page had actually been a U.S. intelligence source. The bottom line, the report shows the Page FISA should have never been obtained. If you don't have the Page FISA, you don't have a Russia investigation. If you don't have a Russia investigation, you can't knock out the president as a candidate at the time of the 26th election, and you can't hamstring the president's first 2 years with a special counsel investigation. I could go on, but Mr. Durham, who has already weighed in, has the next batch of this, and we'll see where it goes. But I do want to take one last thing from our side, because this undoubtedly will be the last hearing because we have no desire to hear anything from our side, minority hearing or otherwise. I want to take the time to thank Mr. Castor and Ms. Callan. They're the top investigators in the Intelligence and Judiciary Committee, and they combined have 15 to 20 years experience in the House conducting investigations to protect American interests and taxpayer dollars. What these public servants don't usually do as a part of their work is field questions from others who come before them, from Democrats, donors, and pundits. Ms. Castor and Ms. Callan usually work for and alongside members of Congress and fellow public servants. I'm sorry today that the majority chose to highlight their investigators and also the ones that have been brought in over these public servants. I'm sorry to choose that this is where we're at, but I would like to thank them for their work today. I'd like to thank them for their work on our behalf, but also I think really for all the ones listening here. If you look around the room, this is what's happening to the American people. By the end of the day, most in the back left, most of the members of the media are begging to go somewhere else because at the end of the day, your case isn't made. And one thing that just keeps amazingly said from Mr. Goldman to the chairman to others, that these facts are undisputed. The very nature of the fact that I say I disagree and you say you don't is a disputed fact. These are disputed facts. It'll be the first impeachment that is partisan on facts that are not agreed to. That is the state in which the judiciary has become. We have become a rubber stamp, just as the chairman predicted almost 20 years ago when we willingly accept from someone else a project or a report that we don't investigate ourselves. And with that is the problem we have, and that is the farce called the Judiciary Committee impeachment scam today. I yield back.
I now recognize myself for concluding remarks. After hearing the reports and the evidence today, we now know several things with certainty. We know that the President was at the center of a scheme to pressure Ukraine to announce an investigation of the President's political rivals. He applied that pressure by withholding both a White House meeting and vital military aid. He made that demand directly to President Zelensky and confirmed his personal involvement on the White House lawn. We know that there are no excuses for this conduct. It is no excuse that President Trump eventually released the aid after his scheme was revealed to the public. And it is no excuse that he insisted that there was no quid pro quo only after his scheme was revealed to the public. We know that his actions endangered our national security, putting our alliances, our reputation, and our safety at risk. We know that the President also compromised the integrity of our elections for a corrupt, private, political purpose. We know that President Trump, in an unprecedented act of obstruction, ordered everybody in the executive branch to defy all congressional subpoenas for documents and subpoenas related to the impeachment inquiry. And we know that his attempts to solicit a political favor from the government of Ukraine fit a pattern of conduct that the President established in 2016 when he solicited political assistance from the government of Russia. That pattern of misconduct undermines our national security and undermines free and fair elections. In abusing his office in this manner and in obstructing the investigation that followed, we know that President Trump has put himself before his country. I am struck by the fact that my Republican colleagues have offered no serious scrutiny of the evidence at hand. They have talked about everything else, but they have offered not one substantive word in the President's defense. I suspect that is because there is at base no real defense for the President's actions. President Trump put himself before his country. There is a constitutional remedy for a president who undermines our national security and our elections, who puts his own interests before those of the country. That remedy is impeachment. The facts are clear. The danger to our democracy is clear, and our duty is clear. President Trump violated his oath to the American people. He placed his own private interests ahead of our national security and the integrity of our elections, and constitutes a continuing threat to the integrity of our elections and to our democratic system of government. Such conduct is clearly impeachable. This committee will proceed accordingly. This concludes today's hearing. We thank all of our presenters for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the presenters or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.